Morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome and thank you once again for attending the Marine Fish Advisory Commission for August of 2023. Let's review the August agenda. And if there's any changes, please speak up. Michael Piednock, I thought you said, no, you were talking about the July meeting. I'm sorry. Any changes to the August agenda? Is everybody satisfied with the agenda? Any hands?
I'm not seeing any changes, Mr. Chair.
Then we can move on, right? We don't need to take a vote on that.
We can, yes.
Okay, review and approval of the July meeting, the draft business meetings. Michael Piednott, you said that you need some changes there yesterday when I spoke with you.
Mr. Chairman, I took a look. I'm fine with it. I'll just have to abstain from the vote since I did not make the last meeting. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that was the issue, right? It said that you were in attendance and you weren't. Was that the issue?
No, it's there that I was not there. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Michael. All right. So do we need a motion on this, Jared?
We do need a motion. That's correct.
And this has got to be a roll call.
That is correct.
Well, folks, I need a motion.
I'll make that motion.
Thank you, Shelley. Need a second?
I will second.
Thank you, Khalil. Is there any opposition to the motion?
It has to be a roll call vote, Mr. Chair.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'll call the roll for you.
Thank you.
Bill Amaru,
Yes.
Khalil Bogdan,
Yes.
Shelley Edmondson,
Yes.
Suki Sawyer. Suki Sawyer.
Yes.
Motion passes 4-0 with 2 abstentions.
Thank you, Jared. Moving along, comments. Well, once again, I welcome everybody to this meeting in August, the soggy summer from Massachusetts. And I really don't have anything else to say at this moment in time, so I'll turn it over to law enforcement. Lieutenant Bass.
Hey, good morning, Mr. Chairman. Apologize for missing the last meeting, but yeah, kind of the typical summer. Obviously get kind of stretched in all directions, but we was mentioned earlier just before the meeting, the striped bass season, the commercial season did close. The fishing on the canal was hit or miss, probably really good at times, but still encouraged that I think the regulation prohibiting commercial fishing on the canal really helped our caseload, cutting down on the on complaints. There were still the typical complaints, but we weren't really chasing our tail. There was a kind of takes a while to figure out where the fish set up. Initially looked like some off in the Haunt, but then they really set up off of Gloucester, Cape Ann area, and people started taking advantage of trying to go out there at on a Sunday before the season, before an open day, and we did put a special operation together. Got a couple of boats out there. Had some local help with the harbor master sitting around the outside of the fleet. The typical thing, everybody's out there with no nav lights and whatnot. Did board, I think, 9 or 10 vessels, all of which had commercial striped bass on the closed day. One did have his full limit of 15. And then all the other associated violations of, no circle hooks, because it's technically not a commercial time. And then when the word finally got out that, we were in the area, everybody just took off, and at which point the harbor masters took over for the no nav lights and the speed and no wake stuff. So that was pretty successful. Of note, the person that did have 15 fish was from out of state. So that might tie into the item coming up for the wildlife compact rule. That would be nice to have a marine fisheries regulations involved in that as well. Outside that, one of our bigger efforts right now is still with the whales. We've been working with Coastal Studies and NOAA. And apparently there was a misunderstanding. They believed that we didn't have any interest in assisting with entanglements and whatnot. That might have been, past decision, but we've assured them that that's not the case. So since then, we've been receiving a bunch of whale disentanglement training, turtle disentanglement gear, and have been assisting with a number of entanglements of adult humpbacks. There's a couple juvenile calves that are showing entanglement, disentangled I know at least one turtle, and assisted with that beached sperm whale a couple of weeks ago in Plymouth. So that's been kind of a win-win for everybody. We did just get a number of complaints that people primarily on Stellwagen are targeting whales for the tuna fishery. So that's probably causing some of those high tensile tuna fishing line entanglements, which are also proving pretty detrimental, and not just lobster gear. But on the hiring front, we as of Monday, we've sworn 4 new officers who are already police officers. So they didn't have to go to the police academy. 6 entered the police academy. So hopefully upon their successful completion in 5 months or so, they will also be sworn in. I believe we're also anticipating hiring 4 more officers. So again, it's a tremendous step forward for us right now, but honestly, if nothing happens next year, it'll just that would be a step back. But it's encouraging to get a lot of some fresh faces coming on right now. And with that, I have nothing else. I can take some questions.
I see. I'm going to recognize Suki Sawyer. He's got his hand up. Suki?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, thanks, Ray. On those all them violations up in Gloucester, do you know if there are any court cases involved, or are they just all ticket violations?
I can look. I think I'd assume I see one arrest report or a summons, at least for the larger one. I also anticipate, if it hasn't already come in, maybe some adjudicatory. Maybe Jared will may see
Yeah.
some of these.
Lieutenant Bass, I can confirm that on at least the one who had the 15 fishing cut some free, that individual will be facing a permit sanction.
Good. Yep.
Okay, thanks for that.
Thank you, Suki. Dan McKiernan, your hand was next.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Matt, doing the math, 4 + 6 + 4, are you describing the hiring of 14 new officers?
Yes.
Oh, great. All right, thanks.
With the hiring process, some people don't make the cut, and then we can only get so many candidates from the HR. So I think the plan was for 14, but we could only successfully hire 10. But I believe they're still attempting to get those last 4 on.
And so, Matt, what's the typical number of departures from the agency that you have, like retirees or resignations or otherwise? So in order to stay even, would you say you need at least like 4 or 5 a year? I mean, what's your sense of that?
That comes and goes depending on, if we have a large class, that was hired 25 years ago, which is going on right now. I think it was one of our largest classes, 14 people. They all pretty much start retiring at about the same time. Mm-hmm. So I'd say at least 4 or 5, and we may be approaching 8 to 10 in the next, 12 months.
Sure.
At least.
All right. Thanks.
Hopefully, our new commissioner, Tom O'Shea, will stay in the governor's ear on this. I know they just passed the state budget, so I don't know how Tom's office, Department of Fish and Game, will be affected. And I don't know how that funding is done for law enforcement, Dan, but hopefully Commissioner O'Shea is cognizant of what we've been trying to do over the years, is to rebuild that force. He can put a good word in for us.
Any help would be appreciated. We are still very light on manpower right now.
Yeah, well, that's been the case for years. All right, thank you, Dan. Michael Piernock, your hand's up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Lieutenant Bass. Could you just provide some details or clarity about, as you mentioned, those that were targeting whales at Stellwagen Bank while tuna fishing?
Yeah, we've been getting complaints from a lot of the whale watch boats. It appears that, when you see the bubble cloud or a bunch of whale surface, that's kind of an indicator that there's a lot of bait, and then also tuna. So people will apparently, from the reports, troll through that cloud, cast into the cloud. And right now, I think there's at least one humpback calf that has a fairly serious entanglement of what appears to be tuna. High, good mono wrapped around that's may endanger its life. So they're concerned with vessels targeting the whales just for tuna. So we're likely be stepping up those patrols on those busy days. I think they said it was typically the weekends and whatnot.
Thank you. Has your office enforcement observed such and cited anyone at this point?
I'd have to look on that. So obviously out on Stellwagen, that's a federal case. So we have, in years past, there's always a half a dozen cases where people take pictures of people doing just that, bouncing lures or whatnot off whales. I'd have to check in the last couple of weeks. I just saw that specific email this morning.
Thank you.
So Lieutenant Bass, what would that incorporate? The Coast Guard with federal enforcement agents?
No, that would be us. We're also deputized as National Marine Fisheries officers. So we could write up the case, but we can't take the actual legal action. We just refer it to an agent, and then we work together. They actually do the any fines or court or whatever else needs to be done. So we don't need anybody else on it. We can do it, but then we refer it, and they have to take the legal action.
Thank you very much. Well, with the diligence on behalf of DMF trying to protect right whales and whatnot, it just gives us more fuel for the budgeting of OLE officers in the state. It's one more issue they have to deal with, and it's manpower. So it's another issue that we could probably incorporate into our letters to the Governor Healy. But that being said, any other questions for Lieutenant Bass?
I'm not seeing any other hands raised, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Commissioner Tom O'Shea, you're up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I heard you, and I've been talking to Colonel Santos that we can't do our job without the support of the MEP, and they make our conservation and our rules stick and observed, and they're just an important partner. And to what extent I can help, I will do that to support the capacity and the number of officers that can help us with our work. So certainly have my support there. I also just want to reiterate what I think you and I were talking about, Mr. Chair, which is that it was a real honor to see the Division of Marine Fisheries awarded with the Spotlight Award from NOAA last month at the State House. And it just real credit to the team who's been working on this, I think, as you had pointed out, for a long time, I think 27 years. And Dan McKiernan, Bob Glenn, and team, really deserve a lot of credit, and it really was great to hear their comments and just to have them acknowledged for their work. I shared that with the Fisheries and Wildlife Board as well, and we'll share it in an all-staff message for the entire department. It was also acknowledged by Undersecretary Cooper from the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. And so great event with the state legislators from the Coastal Caucus present. And anyway, real credit there. I also was able to get out with Jared and some environmental police officers to Menemsha at the Meet the Fleet event on the vineyard, which was great. And good to see some of the fishers out there and just hear what's going on. And so trying to get out there as I can. I also was present with my son fishing at the Real Fishing Day in Castle Island, along with Commissioner Arrigo and his son from DCR. We had a great event, and the DMF team did an awesome job with basically, helping people learn to fish. And, they had my son, I loved it. They had a great swag bag, as they called it, for the kids and for new fishermen and girls. And there were a lot of people there at the fishing pier, and we just saw a lot of interest from people from all generations and backgrounds. So really good event. I did want to mention to you, Mr. Chair, and the commission that the secretary had asked all the commissioners in EEA to come up with some 6-month priorities. This was back a couple months ago. One of the priorities that I have asked the department and the division directors to work with me on and their staff is the development of a department strategic plan for the next 5 years to work on strategies and approaches to elevate sort of 4 theme areas, including biodiversity conservation, climate, environmental justice areas and connecting to those communities, and also positioning our department to have increased funding support and relevancy and visibility through communications and engagement. So those were the 4 themes, and we hope to develop that strategic plan over the next 6 months, and Dan McCannon and team will be, engaged in that to the extent that DMF can support those 4 theme areas. It won't include all the work that they do, because much of the core work goes beyond that. But those were themes that I know that are being worked on across the Secretariat by all the agencies except for the biodiversity piece. So I just wanted to bring that to your attention, and happy to provide updates. We're just getting started on that right now with a consulting firm called the Consensus Building Institute. And we'll be launching it, that process in September, and hoping to conclude in January. And I think it'll really position the department and the divisions with what they need going forward to address those themes, and the funding, and really the strategies for us to make an impact in those areas. So just a quick update on that. Not much else to share on it, but happy to provide an update as we go along. I think that's it for now. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Questions for the commissioner? Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. Questions?
I'm not seeing any hands, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner. We'll move along. The floor is yours, Dan. Director Dan McKiernan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to cover things that are not on the agenda for the most part today in my comments. The first is the haddock and cod regulations that were just released by NOAA Fisheries, I believe last Friday. It's very frustrating timing on the part of NOAA Fisheries for DMF, because we're ready to enact a final rule to complement them so that there's no confusion on the waterfront. But unfortunately, their rulemaking was delayed pretty extensively. This rule should have gone into effect by May 1st. Instead, it went into effect at the end of the first week of August, which is problematic. The final rules created, we are going to enact an emergency reg as fast as possible to make those rules consistent. And furthermore, our current rules say that if you're fishing in federal waters, you can land fish consistent with the federal standards, but it's the state waters fishery that we need to address. So we think for the most part, the for-hire fleet wouldn't be affected by the disparate rules as long as they're fishing in the EEZ. so we're working on that. You know, I talked to Jared, I talked to others who are involved with the rulemaking process, including legal counsel. And it would be just advantageous for us to be able to obtain, you know, some kind of authority going forward so that when we have a compliance measure like this, that we can simply have a facilitated or an accelerated rulemaking, you know, to now have to go through, you know, an emergency action, and which means another public hearing. It's just too much process for something as simple as an amendment to bag and size limits. I also just want to mention that this particular rule surprised us a little bit. The council had not recommended in its final in its final action what NIMS did adopt. NIMS adopted a surprisingly disparate, surprisingly for me anyway, disparate set of rules for hire versus private anglers. And for haddock in the Gulf of Maine, the private vessels are allowed 10 fish at 17. The for hire anglers 15 fish at 18. The Federal Register notice does describe the rationale for it, although I don't necessarily agree with all of it. But I do have a concern about the sort of the growing trend toward different rules for the for hire fleets. And up and down the East Coast, there's a lot of variability among states about those kind of outcomes. And, you know, you'll be hearing more about this. And the commission will remember that back in the Black Sea Bass deliberations in the spring, we actually polled we put out a poll, a voluntary poll about possible sea bass measures. And we asked a series of questions. And one of them was about having disparate measures for hire. There wasn't much support for that. There was majority opposition to that. But it's something I think we need to come to grips with going forward. So, you know, we'll put that on the back burner for now, but believe me, it's going to come up more and more, especially at the Mid-Atlantic Council, where I think there's an entire addendum that's going to be addressing this coming next year. On the endangered species front, the commission will recall, I think we had mentioned about 2 petitions that were submitted to our Massachusetts State Endangered Species Program called the Natural Heritage and Endangered Species Program, and it's housed in the Division of Fisheries and Wildlife at our sister agency. First, there was a public petition from the Pine Barrens Alliance to list horseshoe crabs as a species of special concern. And then there was a second petition by DMF that we asked the program to remove humpback whales off the state endangered species list because the similar action was taken by the federal government about 7 years ago. Unlike the federal endangered species program, which has 2 levels of listing, the top level is endangered and then the secondary level is threatened. And Massachusetts program has 3 levels in its statute: endangered, threatened, which are similar, and then a third one, which is the lowest level of I guess, concern, which is called a species of special concern. So each of those petitions by process established in the endangered species program was sent to outside experts for their review and advice to the MESA program. And then the staff compiles the reviews and makes recommendations to an advisory board in the Division of Fisheries and Wildlife dealing with endangered species. And I'm pleased to report the results. First, the petition to list horseshoe crabs by the Pine Barrens Alliance was not supported by the DFW staff. And then secondly, the petition to remove humpback whales, which is our petition, the staff did not fully support our recommendation or our request based on their review of the outside reviews. And instead, the staff are recommending a downlisting from endangered to that third level, which is species of special concern. And I believe there'd be some kind of a public process moving forward in the future. The program reviews these about every 5 years. And so it's good to take advantage of this, you know, when we can. So anyway, we did make some progress there. So for the most part, we're pleased with those outcomes. Everybody mentioned the Partner in the Spotlight Award. I'm not going to say too much about that, but we were certainly honored, and it was a great day. I also want to mention that there's a pesky little issue we call it the wedge. There's an area between state waters and the federal closure out on Stellwagen that has been left open, but NOAA Fisheries in the last 2 years has taken actions to close that area. 2 years ago, because of their delays in rulemaking, they were only able to close it in April. And then last year, they were able to close it on time, but the timing was pretty rough because they didn't announce the closure till the night before the closure was supposed to go into effect. So that was really awkward and challenging for the fishermen to comply. So I'm preparing a request to NOAA Fisheries to consider doing that on a much more reasonable time frame and to get going on that, because I believe it's their intent to consider rulemaking on that. But here we are in August, and everybody knows the wheels of regulations turn very slowly, and I'm fearful that either they won't get it done or it'll be done at a time that's difficult for either for the whales or for the fishermen. It's our view that this so-called wedge area is kind of a gear storage area for folks who don't want to bring the gear home. And we'd like to see, that area closed to vertical lines. I'm guessing that given all the work that's going on with ropeless fishing gear, it's conceivable there could be some ropeless fishing allowed by NOAA Fisheries in that area. But for now, we think it's best to close that area. On the personnel front, Shellfish has lost 4 staff over the last few months. Program leader Jeff Kennedy retired at the end of last month. Senior bacteriologist Diane Reagan, who works at the Newburyport clam plant, she retired the previous month. Both of those folks had about 40 years of service to DMF. We had a former South Section leader and a policy analyst named Tom Shields, who retired last Friday. And one of our frontline younger classification biologists, Simone Wright, she's resigning, going off to another job, working for the federal government. So those are the outgoings. The good news is we hired an offshore wind specialist, Dr. Justin Bopp, who is going to speak today. And I want to make him part of if not a monthly report on updates on wind, I certainly have him available, because we all know that we could spend countless hours paying attention to the wind issues, not always having much of an effect on the outcomes, but it's really critical that we stay informed and stay abreast of all those developments. And Justin's great, and you'll get to hear from him later. He's stationed up at our Salem facility. Even though most of the offshore wind at this point is in the South Coast, we all know that there's a lot of plans for Gulf of Maine wind in the next decade. And then finally, for events, DMF staff worked the booth at the Gloucester State Fish Pier over the weekend, celebrating the city's 400th birthday, I guess you call it. And then coming up on September 10th, there's the Boston Seafood Festival at the Fish Pier. And on September 16th, we'll have a booth at the Marshfield Lobster Fest. So, Mr. Chairman, that's my report for today. I'll take any questions.
Thank you, Director. Questions for the Director. Suki Sawyer, your hand is raised.
Yeah, thank you, Ray. Dan, with the buoyless fishing thing, the permits that the state gave out for these guys to do that, I thought there was some kind of reporting requirements involved with that. And if so, have you got the reports? And if not, why not? And because when my permit, I have to report by the 15th of the month.
Yeah.
The next month.
Yeah, honest. So I haven't been on that on a daily basis. I think Bob Glenn is on the meeting today. Bob, can you respond to Suki's inquiry?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning, Suki and Dan. Yeah, absolutely. I can report back on that. So about 2 or 3 weeks ago, we received a kind of a comprehensive report from NOAA Fisheries. They provided all the fisheries data that were collected as part of the ropeless fishing work that occurred in the Mass Bay restricted area this past winter. Staff is currently kind of going through that and summarizing that, and we can make that information available within the next couple of weeks.
Okay, Bob, thanks for that.
Thank you, Bob. Another question, Suki, your hand is still up. Michael, I saw your hand up. Michael Piednock, did you lower your hand or?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Any other questions for the director?
Not seeing any, Mr. Chair.
Okay, let's move along then. Items for future public hearings, the wildlife compact rules. Who's going to take this one?
Yeah, let me introduce Jared on this one. So I think we're planning on two sets of public hearings, one in late fall and then maybe in early winter. Jared's going to speak to each of these. The wildlife compact rules is an interesting one. Up until until it was enacted by the Commonwealth, by the legislature, I think there were only 2 states in the Union that hadn't signed on to this, which basically allows us a state to look over into another state's enforcement activities, and assess a comparable sanction on a permit, like say a permit holder in our state or a permit holder from that state if they were to try to then move their businesses to our state. So Jared's going to talk about that. And so why don't we get into that now? It's kind of in the weeds, but it's a really interesting one. And I think as Matt Bass mentioned earlier, this could allow us to sort of work a little bit more cooperatively with our neighboring states or other states when we see these violations across our border. So go ahead, Jared.
Thanks, Dan.
Jared.
So at the end of 2022, former Governor Baker signed into law what is called the Interstate Violators Wildlife Compact. As Dan said, this is we were the 49th state to sign this charter. I think Hawaii is the only state left that hasn't. And basically what it does is it creates a reciprocal enforcement agreement among the states whereby an individual who is a resident in your state who commits a wildlife violation in another state can have their permit sanctioned in their home state, should they be convicted or otherwise fail to comply with the violation. In this instance, where I use the term convicted, I mean either convicted in a court of law whereby the permit is sanctioned, or for criminal or non-civil, or convicted in an administrative court through an adjudicatory proceeding where the permit is sanctioned. Additionally, if an individual is convicted, their name goes into a registry, and effectively that registry allows another state to deny an issuance, or deny or suspend or revoke an issuance of a permit to that individual. So if a Massachusetts resident were to go to Rhode Island and be caught poaching striped bass and be convicted of a striped bass violation in Rhode Island, we could restrict the issuance of their permit in Massachusetts. Alternatively, if a Rhode Island resident were to be convicted of a action in Rhode Island, we could restrict their ability to get a permit here in Massachusetts. So right now, the department's lawyers are working on developing draft regulations for both the Division of Marine Fisheries and the Division of Fish and Wildlife to implement the Wildlife Compact and kind of the nuances of how these reciprocities work. It's a bit dense and it's been a bit of a slog for us in doing that, but we're working with the folks who kind of oversee this at the federal level, and some of the states who have had to recently do this to figure out the best language. Optimistically, I imagine we'll be looking to publish draft regulations and hold public hearings towards the end of this year, with the goal of publishing final regulations prior to the start of the 2024 commission season. And while this doesn't require a commission vote, we'll certainly keep you guys appraised of the progress being made here. So I'll take any questions.
Director, you're recognized.
Yeah, so Jared, earlier in the meeting, when Matt Bass gave his report, he talked about a non-resident angler fishing under the authority of a Massachusetts permit and had violations. So in that instance, if we were successful in suspending or revoking the permit, then that person's home state could take a similar action, right?
If I could interrupt, two things could actually happen there. One, New Hampshire, which is that individual's home state, could revoke any permit, any similar permits held in their state. Additionally, that individual's name would go into a registry, and the other, well, that'd be 47 states, could then deny that individual the opportunity to obtain a permit in their state. So if that person was to go to Rhode Island and try to get a similar permit, Rhode Island could deny them as well.
Thanks.
A quick question before I move on to other members. Jared, that wouldn't happen to have been the same commercial fisherman from New Hampshire who got busted a number of years ago for black sea bass, I
I
believe.
don't believe it was, but I'm not, I can't speak to that. But this was a new name to me.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Director. Your hand's still up. Mike Piernock, your hand is up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Jared. Just a few questions. If there's a violation in federal waters, criminal or administrative, and it's at a federal level, would this apply to such to then restrict or take away the rights in state waters for any permits?
There's usually a landing permit of some variety involved in any federal violation that the state could take action on. I'd have to check with our lawyers to determine if a federal action would fall within this compact. This mainly deals, historically, this has really dealt with inland hunting and fishing. So it's really been focused on the state to state, deer hunting rules and things like that. It's application in salt water. While it occurs, it's it wasn't the original intent of this action. So I'd have to check with them to see if any federal administrative action would result in the state being able to take an action on an individual. But that said, any federal action could result in the state taking action on that person's landing permit, and then that would certainly trigger the wildlife compact.
You good, Michael?
Additional question, yes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The fact that we're not far from Canada, if somebody has habitual violations there, I just throw it out there. It may be an overreach. I'm just thinking out loud of different things that we'd want to take prudent action if such violations are occurring. I don't think this provides the ability to do that because it'd be Canadian waters or international waters. In addition, could you provide me an example of an administrative conviction in general, what that means?
Sure. So any of the adjudicatory proceedings that I initiate, if those end up with some type of permit sanction, being whether that's an agreement of the parties whereby we settle a matter into some type of permit suspension, as was the case with some of the right whale closure violations observed back in 2022, or if it goes to hearing and our magistrate renders a ruling for suspension or revocation, as was the case with the Brian Roach incident a year or so back. Those would both constitute administrative convictions.
Thank you, Jared.
Thank you, Mike.
Michael. Thank you, Jared. I see Lieutenant Bass has got his hand up.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, just for some clarification, I think this is a great compact. We actually had a couple of years ago, just before went into effect, some massive hunting violations, deer and turkey, from some people out of Pennsylvania. And we asked, why are you hunting here? And it's because they can't hunt anywhere else in the country. So this is bringing us up to speed with everybody else. And then maybe to put it in perspective for our marine fishery side, I mean, a couple of years ago, typically we get a lot of people, depending on where the fish set up, that will take advantage of taking commercial size fish and limits out of Rhode Island and then selling them in Massachusetts. That happened fairly recent, where Rhode Island made a pretty big case about it. They knew they said they were selling in mass, but there was nothing we could do. That's not something we want as fish taking away our quota coming from another state illegally. And in this case, I think, we could have suspended their permit and prevented them from ever selling fish or getting a permit here in Mass. So that it just kind of seals up these loopholes for us. So if that clarifies anything.
Thank you, Lieutenant Bass. Questions for Lieutenant Bass on his comment? Are you seeing any hands, Jared? I'm not.
No.
No. Any other questions about this for Jared?
Not seeing any hands, Mr. Chair.
Move along.
So Ray, the second item for public hearing coming up shortly is the rules to support Addendum 27 to the ASMFC Interstate Lobster Plan. And I'll let Jared cover those.
Okay.
Thank you, Dan. Jared?
All right. So the Lobster Board back in May 2023 approved Addendum 27 to the Lobster FMP for implementation in 2024. It's designed to proactively address decreasing spawning stock biomass for the Georges Bank Gulf of Maine lobster stock. And it's kind of a two-part action. The first part, which we'll be dealing with in public hearing this fall, is to immediately resolve regulatory discrepancies between state and federal permit holders in the Outer Cape Lobster Management Area, and to close a loophole that allows permit holders from Area 1 and Area 3 to obtain 10% more trap tags in their trap allocation. So under the new rule, they'll only be able to obtain their trap allocations worth of trap tags. Then the second component is in future years, if the stock declines by 35% from the 2016 to 2018 reference level that was established in this addendum, then that would trigger several states' actions. So I'll get into what these specific changes are on the next slide. But to just touch on the rulemaking timeline, this requires implementation by 2024. So we'll likely be moving to publish draft regulations and hold public hearings during the fall, and then come back to you maybe at a late 2023 or early 2024 business meeting with a final proposal for a vote, with the goal of getting these new rules in for the 2024 fishing year. So what the initial proposal is, what we need to do for 2024 is threefold. First, there are disparate maximum gauge sizes within the Outer Cape Management Area. The Federal Waters Outer Cape Federal Waters Outer Cape Fishery, meaning any fishing occurring in the federal portion of that area or by a federal permit holder, is subject to a 6 3/4 maximum gauge size. The state waters portion of that fishery does not currently have a maximum gauge size, and this would establish a 6 3/4 inch maximum gauge size for that fishery. And I believe, and Tracy or Bob, correct me if I'm wrong, that's about an 8-pound lobster. Additionally, there's disparate VNOC definitions and VNOC rules for the federal outer Cape fishery and the state outer Cape fisheries. The federal outer Cape fishery has a 1/8 inch VNOC rule, whereas the state outer Cape fishery has a 1/4 inch VNOC rule, and this would make it so that both the state and the federal fishery have a 1/8 inch VNOC rules, and that would be both the maximum gauge and the VNOC rule for the outer Cape would then be consistent with adjacent Area 3, which is offshore Georges Bay. Additionally, we'll be eliminating the practice of issuing 10% additional trap tags to cover the loss of routine gear loss in areas 1 and 3. And that permit holders will be required to document track loss to obtain replacement tags. And then, Dan, I see your hand up. You want to jump in?
Yeah, thanks, Jared. And I don't know if you're going to cover this, and if you were, I apologize, but the implications of this more consistent rule in the Outer Cape actually reverberates all the way across the state, because our current dealer standard for V-notches in commerce is the more liberal Outer Cape standard of a 1/4 inch sharp without cedal hairs. By raising that standard on the Outer Cape state-only fishermen, it means that becomes the new sort of minimal standard that officers can then enforce throughout the state. So, it's not just an officer that's going to be patrolling, Outer Cape Cod that would need to be cognizant of this new standard. Officers all the way over to New Bedford and all the way north to Gloucester, and even in dealers would then be making this or enforcing the standard as a possession standard in commerce. So one of the challenges, of course, is to make sure that all the officers have proper gauges to measure this 1/8 inch indentation, and so we're working on that as well. Bob and I have been trying to reach out to some of the metal fabricators to make sure that they have proper devices to enforce this rule. So it's bigger than just 40 guys in the Outer Cape.
I think the same would go for the 6 3/4 maximum gauge size. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. Yep.
Thank you. And then last is potential future rulemaking. So, as this is kind of a 2-part addendum, the second part is to address decreasing spawning stock biomass, proactively address that should it occur, should we start seeing reductions in the population. And what they've done is created a 2016 to 2018 reference period and committed to certain actions being taken if the stock decreases by 35% from that reference period. So what that is in year 1, minimum size increase for LMA 1 with no changes to the minimum size gauge for the Outer Cape, or LMA 3. Year 3, another minimum size increase from LMA 1, no changes for the Outer Cape or LMA 3. Year 4, changes to the escape vent size for LMA 1, no changes for the Outer Cape or LMA 3. And then in year 5, decreases in the maximum gauge size for the Outer Cape and LMA 3, but no changes for LMA 1. So this would bring the LMA 1 minimum size from 3 1/4 inch to 3 3/8 inch over a period of 3 years, and then decrease the maximum gauge size from 6 3/4 inch to 6 1/2 inch in year 5 for the Outer Cape and offshore LMA 3 folks. Dan?
Dan, your hand is up.
Oh, looks like he doesn't have anything to add there. So,
Okay. Questions for Jared? Suki, you're recognized.
Yeah, thank you. As the Atlantic States, this commission with their benchmarks, using the data from the ventless trap surveys in Massachusetts, is that part of it?
It is this index of abundance that needs to decline by 35% is a blended value of trawl surveys and ventless trap surveys. So both surveys results go into that value. And Suki, you know that the ventless trap work is something that we accomplish with contracted lobstermen, and we do it every summer. And so I think there's a lot of confidence in that particular data set among the industry. And our trial survey has done a pretty good job historically of tracking, landings, the trends in landings as well. So, but anyway, it's the the Maine, New Hampshire trial survey, and then the Maine ventless trap, the Mass ventless trap. I don't know if New Hampshire has a ventless trap. Maybe Bob Glenn knows, but yes, long answer to the short question.
Okay, thanks. I was gonna ask about the other states, but you already said it. Okay, thanks, Dan.
Thank you, Suki. Questions for Jared or Dan on this addendum? Well, you see
Not
any
seeing
hands?
any other hands raised, Mr. Chair?
Well, I have a question. So in this addendum 27, the only hardship, the immediate hardship is going to be the Outer Cape lobstermen. And Dan, hopefully we will have a meeting with Chip. Bill Amaru might want to get involved with this also. I'm sure he's hearing from the Outer Cape, the 42 harvesters, because they're going to be immediately impacted. And I would like to move forward with Chip and see if we can get a hardship for individuals because they gave up their federal permits 20 years ago.
Yeah,
But
so Ray, let me address that, and that's something I'll be happy to write to Mike Penny and ask him for their thoughts. But what Ray is talking about here is the fact that over the last 30 years or so, there's been a number of state actions and then ASMFC actions that made it more lucrative for Outer Cape fishermen to not have federal permits, and many of them surrendered those federal permits in order to capitalize on the more lenient VNOC standards. Back in the 90s, that relief came from a bill filed by a state senator and enacted into law for a time certain. And then over the last 12 or so years, maybe 15 years, the ASMFC did not approve enacting that same VNOC possession standard for the Outer Cape as the federal government did. So over time, we used to have about we used to have more federal permit holders, but now they're predominantly the Chatham fleet, where you really can't do very well fishing exclusively in state waters. But most of the Nauset and the Provincetown fishermen did forego their federal permits. So the idea that Ray had is to, and some fishermen have had, is to appeal to the National Marine Fisheries Service to maybe get federal permits back, because the Outer Cape Lobster Management Area is fixed in terms of its total number of traps. That's a cooperative program with the federal government. So it actually wouldn't result in any new fishing effort, but it could result in some shift of fishing effort, but not any new fishing effort in the totality of the Outer Cape Cod Lobster Management Area.
Dan, thank you very much. You're quite the spokesman. Thank you for your explanation. Any other questions on addendum 27?
I'm not seeing any, Mr. Chair.
Okay, then let's move it along. Federal and Interstate Fisheries Management, joint ASMFC, Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council issues. I believe Nicola will probably.
Yep, this is Nicholas today. Melanie isn't joining us today, so Nicola's going to focus exclusively on the ASMFC and also Mid-Atlantic actions. They work pretty closely hand in hand. There's very few species that are, it's only, well, there's a couple that New England and the ASMFC manage, but it's much less complicated, in terms of co-management. So when Nicola gives a presentation on deliberations on our Mid-Atlantic species, it's invariably covering the actions of both the commission and the council. So go ahead, Nick.
Good morning. Thank you, Dan and Mr. Chairman. So as Dan said, I'll be covering the August meetings of both the council and commission before passing it off to Dr. Armstrong to provide us an update on some news that was released by NOAA Fisheries about MRIP effort estimation just before the Mid-Atlantic Council meeting and made a bit of a splash. So the joint meeting of the ASMC and the Mid-Atlantic Council dealt largely with setting the specifications for fluke scup, sea bass, and bluefish. And so I'll take a quick look at the latest stock assessment information for those species that led into the setting of the commercial quotas and recreational harvest limits for those species first. So for each of these slides where I'm showing these graphs, what you're going to find are the latest stock assessment results, starting with the spawning stock biomass on the left, the fishing mortality rate on the center graph, and then the recruitment estimates on the far right. So this is the stock assessment results in brief for summer flounder from the most recent management track assessment that was completed this year and included data through 2022. It found that while spawning stock biomass remains somewhere between the target and threshold levels, 83% of the target to be specific, fishing mortality has increased to being above the fishing mortality threshold in 2022. So we're now in an overfishing designation for summer flounder. Interestingly, the catch limits for summer flounder have not been exceeded, and so that fishing mortality is not, being exceeded. Or the overfishing designation is not coming from catch limits being exceeded, but rather the fact that the catch limits in prior years were set too high, too optimistically. And part of what fed into that was that the recruitment estimates, as you can see on the right, were overestimated in prior assessments. That little peak that you see in the dotted line all the way was a 2018 year class that was thought to be strong and one of the first above average year classes since 2010. And the new assessment brought that estimate and the others down. And so we're in a period of below average recruitment for summer flounder since 2010. And that has caused a more recent decline in SSB, as you can see on the left graph in terms of the biomass. So this information fed into the council's specification setting process. The SSC sets uses the overfishing limit, comes out of the assessment. The SSC, the Scientific and Statistical Committee, sets the acceptable biological catch per the council's risk policy, and 2023 is shown for reference. The specifications were set for 2024 and 2025, and you can see a notable decline in the acceptable biological catch. That is split between the commercial and recreational fisheries, 55-45%. And after commercial discards and recreational discards are accounted for, it is leading to a coast-wide commercial quota for 2024 that is a 42% reduction from 2023. Notably, that commercial quota of 8.79 million pounds is below a recently adopted 9.55 million pound trigger, above which quota is allocated in a different state-by-state formula where Massachusetts and other Northeast states get a higher percentage. So while the commercial quota on the coastwide level is going down 42%, you'll see a little bit of an additional decline in our state-specific quota. And Story, when he provides the quota monitoring report later on, we'll discuss those state-specific quotas for these species as well and what we're looking at for next year. On the recreational side, the recreational harvest limit is being reduced 40% from 2023. What this means for the measures for all these species that are jointly managed will not be determined until the December meeting of the council and commission meeting jointly. And and in that method, we use a model now to estimate harvest under status quo rules and compare that to the recreational harvest limit. And then based on stock status, figure out what bin of a percent reduction is being required. So we are looking at a 6.35 million pound coastwide recreational harvest limit for next year. You can compare that, however, to recreational landings in 2022, which were over 10 million pounds. And we had status quo measures this year. So my early guess, very early guess, is that we should expect at least a 10% reduction in recreational measures for next year, perhaps more, up to a maximum of 40%. Moving on to SCUP, stock status remains similar to the prior assessment. There was again a 2023 management track assessment for SCUP. The resource continues to be well above its biomass target, 250% of the target. Overfishing is not occurring. This assessment did have a retrospective pattern in the results that were not seen in prior assessments. However, it's in what is considered the good direction in that SSB is underestimated and fishing mortality is overestimated. So in the next assessment, those shift in a direction that is favorable towards stock status. Recruitment, however, in the last couple of years, we've not seen a similarly high level of recruitment like we saw in that 2011 peak that you can, or 2015 peak that you can see on the right-hand side. But this is leading into specifications for 2024 and 2025 that are a notable increase in the acceptable biological catch. The allocations are split 65% commercial, 35% recreational, and after the discards are accounted for, this leads to a commercial quota that is increasing 51% for 2023 and a recreational harvest limit that is increasing 42% for 2020 into 2024. So the commercial landings in recent years have been around 14 million pounds, so they're or lower. So that's a lot of an increase for the commercial fishery that may go underutilized. Meanwhile, the recreational harvest limit is still below the recent level of recreational landings. And so my early guess again would be to expect about a 10% reduction. Because of this mismatch, however, there was discussion at the Council and Commission meeting to consider initiating an addendum that would allow for quota to be transferred between the two sectors. However, that was not ultimately supported by the Council in a 9-9 vote, and the Commission was not able to vote on it due to our voting procedures when we meet as a joint body. But that's where we look for SCUP. But again, it'll not be until December that we have a better idea of what it means for the recreational limits. With black sea bass, you'll see that I'm not showing any graphs from a recent stock assessment because there was not one completed similar to the other species. A research track assessment is ongoing in which the model, is likely going to change. New data are being incorporated and considered. There was a slight delay in that research track assessment. It is scheduled now to go to peer review in October, and so it won't be until next year that we have a management track assessment to set the 2025 specifications with. So the Scientific and Statistical Committee agreed to set a 2024 ABC that was equal to the 2023 ABC, even though they noted some concern that biomass is expected to decline, given that there haven't been really large year classes like the 2011 and 2015 year classes in recent years. And what this leads to is a situation of a increasing commercial quota due to a reduction in the commercial discards estimate and a slight decrease in the recreational harvest limit, given an increase in recreational discards being estimated. So the commercial quotas are going up 25% from 2023 on the coastwide level, and a 4% decrease. And as you can compare that 6.27 million pound recreational harvest limit to what the landings were, for example, in 2022, were over 8 million pounds. We did take a 10% reduction in the measures this year. So my early guess is that we're either going to be in a box that says we have to take a 10% increase or a 10% decrease, but we'll have to wait to see what the next few months bring for the recreational setting process. One item of note is related to black sea bass is that NOAA Fisheries disagreed with part of the council's submitted Amendment 23 document, in which the council had requested that the state-by-state allocations for commercial black sea bass be put into the federal FMP. They already reside in the state FMP, and the ASMFC has been monitoring and managing those state quotas since they were implemented. The council was interested to be a part of that, and NOAA Fisheries declined that part of the amendment to address, additional unnecessary administrative burden, as well as the representation issues that exist due to lack of New England state representation on the Mid-Atlantic Council. Moving on to bluefish, there was a management track assessment this year, which was an update of a research track assessment from last year, which made significant improvements and changes to the model and the data. Some of the data changes included a change in the recreational release mortality rate that's used in the assessment, the use of age-specific natural mortality, regional estimation of the discard weight based on smaller fish being caught in the southern region, and a revision to the MREP CPU index that's used in the assessment that has a very has a very notable impact on the results. And some of what these changes culminated in is that the biomass estimates for bluefish have come down, and notably the spawning stock biomass target, which was previously set at a level above any estimates recorded, has come down as well. So on the left-hand side, we see that the spawning stock biomass has made it out of the overfish designation. So 2 or 3 years ago, bluefish was designated overfished and put into a rebuilding plan with a 2028 target. So the rebuilding plan is in place. We've gotten out of the overfish level. Fishing mortality is below the threshold. However, because of that downward kind of scaling of the biomass estimates, the acceptable biological catch for bluefish is decreased significantly from 2023 to 2024. This is leading to a reduction in the commercial quota for next year of 44%. It's a slightly less reduction for Massachusetts in particular, because we're in the 3rd year out of a 7-year transition of new commercial quota allocations, in which states, including Massachusetts, is getting a slightly higher share. So our reduction will be a little bit less than 44%. On the recreational side, the percent reduction in the RHL is less. It's only 15%, and that's because in 2023, this year, we had about a 5.5 million pound for pound overage to pay back through an accountability measure. For bluefish, the timeline of setting recreational measures is a little bit different, and so that has actually already occurred at this joint meeting. And based on the recent average recreational landings being very similar to the upcoming year's RHL status quo measures were selected for the bluefish fishery on the recreational side. So I just wanted to note briefly that this process by which we are now setting recreational measures, called the percent change approach, when it was adopted a year ago, it did have a sunset provision of 2025. So the council and commission are starting the process to develop a replacement for it when that sunsets. It could be actually extending the current approach with some modifications, as well as 2 other approaches that were initially considered considered are going to continue to be developed, but the overall goal of this, a new recreational measure setting process is to put less emphasis on just looking at the RHL and the recreational landings, and to account for the uncertainty in the MREP data, and also consider stock biomass and trend data and recruitment when we determine how much of a change in the recreational measures has to be taken, in hopes of providing some additional stability and predictability in the measures for the recreational fishery. There is a heavy workload, however, for this document. It's pretty technical, and so it is impacting the workload or the schedule for that recreational sector separation amendment that Dan mentioned earlier. That was an amendment that was previously initiated by the Council and Commission and was due to be started this year to look at recreational sector separation and recreational catch accounting for these 4 species that I've been discussing. But startup on that is going to be delayed until next year, and it's likely about a 2-year development process for that amendment. 2 climate change related issues that I wanted to mention were the culmination of a multi-year process by the East Coast councils, along with NOAA and the ASMFC, on a East Coast climate change scenario planning. There is now a final document out, which includes an action menu of potential items that the councils and commissions could look to in the coming years to introduce more climate readiness into their governance and management of our fisheries. The councils and commissions are expected to incorporate actions into their annual planning processes moving forward. Some of these deal with, there were 3 major themes of cross-jurisdictional governance, how we manage our species with an expectation of increased uncertainty in the future, data sources and partnerships. And at the meeting, NOAA Fisheries did announce some additional funding that is expected, that's going to be helping the councils to implement this type of climate change readiness work. There was also, related to this, NOAA Fisheries also has released a procedural directive that would provide guidance to the section of Magnuson that allows them to identify council jurisdiction for species management, and when and what type of data and processes they would use for reviewing and potentially revising the jurisdiction of a council for a managed species. The Mid-Atlantic Council had a lot to say about this draft document, about the rationale and the necessity for it, and the type of data that's going to be reviewed and how it would be done. And they encouraged NOAA Fisheries to have a public scoping or public comment period on the document, which NOAA was not planning to do. They don't have to do a Federal Register public hearing for a procedural directive, but based on the council's interest in this, NOAA Fisheries did say that they'll be holding a public informational webinar, and so information about that will be coming out soon if you're interested in it. And as a state that is often kind of between council management, might be something of interest to pay attention to. So moving on to striped bass, which this will be really the one thing I'll talk about from the ASMFC meeting that was in early August, and where we are with the development of draft addendum 2, as well as the emergency action that was implemented this year. And so the board did extend the emergency action, which implemented a 31-inch recreational maximum size. That was extended for an additional year through next October, unless sooner replaced by addendum 2, which the development is ongoing and expected to be implemented prior to that emergency action expires. All states did meet the deadline of July 2nd to implement the 31-inch recreational maximum size limit. And then the board also while it was initially hoped that the draft addendum would be approved for public comment at the August meeting and go for final action at the ASMC annual meeting, based on the number of revisions that were requested by the board, that schedule is being delayed by one meeting cycle. And so it's not expected that we'll have final action on this addendum until the January meeting of the ASMFC. So that would put public hearings for the document in November and December, most likely, if this stays on track now. But both the emergency action and the draft addendum respond to these projections that we got earlier in the year, that we have a much lower chance of meeting our rebuilding goal if harvest stays at the level that it was in 2022. So the draft addendum is looking at reducing removals by 14.5% from 2022 to achieve the F target associated with rebuilding in 2024. So specifically, what happened with the recreational measures, I kind of wanted to cover this a little bit in detail so that you understand why the document was delayed, as I've heard some criticism of the ASMC, quote unquote, kicking the can on this, but a great number of revisions were requested for the recreational options as well as the commercial options. And in order to have a document that could be understood and garner, public comment in a beneficial way for the process, a lot more revisions needed to be made. So on the recreational ocean side, what you're seeing here is the table of options that the PDT initially developed in response to the board's request for alternative slot limits, as well as harvest season closures to meet a 16% reduction, which is what was estimated to be needed if only the recreational fishery were taking a reduction. Ultimately, the board removed consideration of harvest closures, seasonal harvest closures for the recreational fishery, and really focused in on just maintaining the current emergency action slot limit of 28 to 31 inches, which is estimated to achieve just over a 14% reduction, and is very close to that 14.5% that is being targeted across all sectors. There was, however, an option added that would have a separate for hire measure, which would be a wider slot limit from 28 to 33 inches in response to public comment that was received on the emergency action about a narrow slot limit, increasing discards, and the particular needs of the for hire fishery to provide a fish to take home. On the Chesapeake Bay side, the board narrowed a similarly lengthy list of options down to 3, with some additional sub-alternatives added in. These really focus on putting a maximum size on the Chesapeake Bay recreational fishery of either 23, 24, 25, or 26 inches, and whether or not the minimum size and the bag limit are also standardized is part of the range of alternatives. For the Chesapeake Bay, there was also a for hire separate measure requested to be included, which for that option H that you see at the bottom, where it's 1 fish for all modes, there would be an alternative that would be 2 fish for the for hire fleet in recognition of the smaller size of fish being harvested. One additional option for the recreational fishery that was also added was options to address state allowances for at-sea filleting, such that options that would improve compliance with the size limit where at-sea filleting is allowed, such as the retention of racks being required, skin needing to be left on the fillets, and only having 2 fillets allowed per legal fish. On the commercial side, there was also some extensive revisions requested. Initially, the board had only requested options that would look at the implementation of a maximum size limit for the commercial fishery. The PDT had a number of questions related to how that would be implemented. So first, the board made some of those decisions in order to take them out of the document as options, as to what are the size limits and the quotas that we're looking at when you implement a maximum size, and would we be adjusting the quotas to maintain a similar level of spawning potential. And so the decisions were made there that yes, if we implement a maximum size, there will be quota reductions indirectly from those, to account for harvesting of smaller fish and maintaining a consistent level of future spawning potential. So those analyses need to take place at a state by state level, and the technical committee is working on those to see what the quotas would be that's associated with each of the options for a maximum size, which on the ocean fishery is 38, 40, or 42 inches. The board also decided, however, to add a second set of commercial options, which would just be looking at taking a commercial quota cut of 14.5% to match the overall reduction that is needed. So those will also be included. And that concludes what I wanted to share on striped bass for the ASMFC meeting. And I'll leave it up to you, Mr. Chairman, if you'd like Dr. Armstrong to jump into his presentation about the NOAA MREP results, or take questions first.
And I'm sorry, I was, Nicola, I'd rather board members be able to have questions for you, and then we'll move on with Dr. Mike Armstrong's.
Sounds good.
I see Dan McKiernan's got his hand up. Director?
Thanks, Ray. Nicola, could you review one more time some of those timing issues? I understand the ASMFC meeting is scheduled for the end of January. And it's at that point that I think you're forecasting we could approve an addendum, which means we'd be coming home in the first week of February with some new quota reductions possibly, but there would be ample time for us Northeast states to affect our commercial fisheries. And so maybe talk about that. And before you do, I just want to parenthetically say that the Mid-Atlantic states are going forward with their commercial fisheries for this winter without any change because of the timing of that fishery, plus their administrative requirements to do things like issue tags to individual fishermen. So after all the discussion that went on, many of those Mid-Atlantic states, in the Bay jurisdiction said, oh yeah, we can't do this for the 2024 quotas because those are already kind of baked into our process, and we have to hand out those tags. So getting back to my main question, or ask for clarification, could you describe what you think we're going to be facing in early February as we come home, and what rulemaking we might need for next year?
So I mean, you summarized it very well, and that I would expect that the implementation date for the commercial measures may be later than the implementation date for recreational fisheries. As particularly since we already have the emergency rule in place on the recreational fishery, there's only one option to kind of extend that. So states already have that in place. So that could carry forward into 2024 quite quickly. But a number of states expressed concern or the inability to make changes to their commercial quota for next year after they administer tags this fall, with some of them already placing those orders and getting ready to administer them per their ITQ systems within the next month or two. So I expect that there could potentially be a delay in the implementation of commercial quota reductions or a maximum size limit. It gets a little complicated though, because later next year we'll also be getting the results of the 2024 stock assessment. So how that will play into the process of what is implemented potentially the year after for the commercial fishery remains to be seen. But I expect that a decision will be made in January about a quota and or size limit change. And states are always allowed to implement changes more expediently than what is required. So that would be a state-specific decision on that front.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Nicola. Questions for Nicola? Michael Piernock, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Nicola. Quick question with each one of these species, summer flounder, scup, black sea bass, and bluefish. When you look at the combined total, the ABC for each species, was scup the only one that they didn't go over in total, or was that the same for a few of the others there? I was quickly going through my math, and I know it's the case for scup, but were the others under the ABC when you combine the rec as well as the commercial?
Well, the table that I showed, provided the split of the ABC to each of the fisheries. In the scup fishery, we do have seen a larger underage on the commercial side. However, it's possible that with scup, we are actually seeing the overfishing limit may have been exceeded in last year due to a recreational overage, a substantial recreational overage, some of which was expected because the board and council have made decisions to maintain status quo regulations, even when cuts were suggested because of, for example, the newness of the new MRIP data and how we were responding to that, the stock size for scup and other issues. So it's really the two sectors, commercial and recreational, differ a bit for each species, where there has been scup recreational overages, and the commercial underage has provided a buffer against that recreational overage, and that was one of the reasons that was expressed by council members in not supporting a provision to transfer quota between the two sectors. Black sea bass, there have been recreational overages and some commercial underage as states have adjusted their measures to try to take the additional quota. And summer flounder, there have been ABC underages, but yet that has still led to the overfishing occurring, indicating that those were set too high.
One more question, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you, Nicola. It's unfortunate that it was voted down about the quota transfers. I don't know whether you have an answer to this, or I need to go to NOAA for the answer, but consistent with National Standard 1, in order to get maximum sustainable yield, the purpose of it is to catch what is then the ABC that's developed for maximum sustainable yield. And when we have situations where overall the ABC is not exceeded, and you could share it between the commercial or rec fishery to balance it out to have it under, how is that not inconsistent with National Standard 1 and therefore not permitted or allowed?
Well, we did raise the point of national standards in terms of maximizing the benefit to the nation, which the current commercial recreational allocation split for scup may not be doing in our mind, but the ABC has been achieved. It's just not been in the commercial recreational split that is part of the FMP. There has been enough of a recreational overage that the ABC is being taken for scup.
Michael?
I'm good. I think Dr. Armstrong's going to discuss the MREP issues and naturally how that impacts all the items we just discussed, as well as all the fisheries which are managed, but I'll let Mike say what he has to say, and we'll go from there. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Bill Amaru, your hand is raised.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I'm going to refer over to the fluke part of the presentation. I wasn't surprised to hear that we would be looking at a reduction in our quotas for next year overall, but the 42%, yeah, the 15.27 down to 8.79, that really is a bit of a shock. Anyway, all I want to say is we're seeing really good abundance of fluke, no different than the last several years as we've been building up towards this quota. So I have no concern about the health of the stock. I believe the stock will be great to the future too. A small reduction would have been more what I would have recommended if I were involved with the rulemaking. But I just want to say that I hope that the state of Massachusetts, in achieving these reductions, does not do to the fishery what happened to the fishery when I was actively pursuing it, bringing quotas down to almost non-commercial values. This is a big drop in allocation of quota, and I just hope that the fishery can maintain. It's a very small number of vessels that are pursuing these fish inshore, at least, and the offshore quota system that we've devised has been very liberal when the fish are in those offshore areas. I would hope that those fisheries would be the ones that would be reduced to a point where a major part of the reduction can be achieved by these very large strip limits that we've been implementing towards the end of the season as the quotas were not caught, and that the inshore fishery can maintain itself for the half a dozen or so vessels and the 10 or 20 fishermen that are involved in it, and the infrastructure necessary to keep them going. If they lose another fishery inshore, it could be the end of the inshore mobile gear fishery in southern New England for the state of Massachusetts. Anyway, those are my thoughts on fluke. And harkening back to a topic I didn't mention earlier, the Outer Cape lobster management area. Yes, Ray was right. I will be keeping an eye and communicating with the fishermen. I can tell you already that there's been a number of guys that have left the industry because they saw the changes that were coming is incompatible with their needs. So there are going to be major implications for the Outer Cape management area because of the new rules that'll be put in. And that's my comments for this very thorough and well presented section of the meeting.
Thank you, Bill. Questions for Ms. Meserve? Bill, your hand is still up.
I apologize. I'll lower it.
Okay, thank you. I didn't know if you had another question.
Oh, I forgot. And now I'll even unmute myself.
Questions for Nicola? Anybody from the commission? Any members from the commission? Gary, I'm not seeing any hands. Are you?
Neither, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Nicola. Another great presentation. We're going to move this along to Dr. Mike Armstrong, and he can explain the latest and greatest letter from NOAA, which the Mid-Atlantic Council received on their opening day of their council meeting a week ago, Monday. Mike, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, everyone. So NOAA dropped a news release about a week ago that has created a little bit of a stir. So it reports on 2 pilot studies that have looked at biases in the estimation of fishing effort. And these have been going on over the last few years. And I'll emphasize that particularly one of them is a pilot study, which pilot studies are designed to look at variance, look at the design of your study, and then perfect it and do it in a bigger way. And so keep that in mind. So what I'm going to talk about is, just to remind you, MRIP is a combination of 2 things. One is the field intercepts, where we interview fishermen coming off the water. We do that portion and give the data to the feds. So that's the catch per unit effort. If you multiply that by effort, that's the estimate of catch. And so effort is estimated from the fishing effort survey, which became a mail survey, switched over from a phone survey about 5, 6, maybe 7 years ago. So when they switched over to the mail survey, they did see a big jump in effort, and that precipitated all the way through all fisheries as MRIP re-estimated what the catch was. So these pilot studies included data from Florida, Georgia, Maryland, and Mass. And so the sample size is not as big as it could be. So that's one precautionary thing we need to understand going forward. All these studies are ongoing all the time because the National Academy of Science reviews the program all the time and so they're working with some of the top statisticians in the world, looking at potential biases and trying to make MRIP the best possible product it can be, keeping in mind it's a survey. There will always be error bars and biases, but MRIP program is trying really hard to fix these, and they discovered some things that might be a problem. Next slide. So the first study has actually been published in a peer-reviewed journal. It looked at a shortened recall time. Right now, if you get a thing in the mail, the primary question is, how many fishing trips did you do in the last 2 months? And then it'll also ask, how many did you do in the entire year? But the important question is the 2 months. So they did a study looking at shortening that to 1 month and asking 1 month and 2 months and some combinations. And I'm going to talk at very high level general because there's lots of details that are in these published reports. But the general finding of the first study is there wasn't a lot of difference between asking for trips in 1 month or 2 months. So that's all I'll say about that one. Study 2 is what's causing some angst. They found recall bias related to the order that survey questions were asked. And this is pretty amazing when you think about it. And this underlines the difficulty of all surveys. You know, when you listen to, okay, who's winning the presidential race or who's in the primary, the biases and the difficulty of actually getting numbers is stunning. But what they found, currently, the survey that you get in the mail, it asks for a 2-month recall and then a 12-month recall. So how many trips did you do in the last 2 months? How many did you do altogether? Well, they tried reversing those. They did a number of different combinations, but the bigger one is they asked for how many did you do in 12 months? And then they asked how many did you do in 2 months? And that created quite a difference. The difference when you ask the 12-month recall first, the estimates were lower in 9 out of 10 cases. And we're looking at different modes and different ways and different states. That's where the 10 cases come from. So they range from 13 to 80% less than the current estimates. Overall, when you pull the data, now keeping in mind, we can break it down finer, but what goes in the assessment is the entire coast. So it's not quite as bad, but overall estimates of effort were around 30% lower when the 12-month recall question preceded the 2-month recall question. The question becomes, why would that happen? And it really goes back to psychology and a whole bunch of things that the survey people know, and they're trying to understand. But it's called bounding. When you put the 12-month recall first and then go to the 2-month, it makes you think about the real numbers. So when you ask for 2-month recall, you tend to overestimate. And then you do the 12. So when you do the 12, you have to then recalibrate it to thinking how many you did in the two. So I'm not doing a good job explaining because it's difficult to explain and they haven't fully understood it yet. But it's the psychology of taking it and bounding the question and making you think about the actual period that you're recalling in more detail. Next slide. Because of the high variability among waves, modes, and states, it's difficult to draw a conclusion from this study. However, they conclude that it is likely that effort may be overestimated currently. And so this may explain a little bit or maybe a major part of why when they implemented the male study, the FES effort went up everywhere. If that's true, then everything will have to be re-estimated again. But keep in mind, it was a pilot study. The numbers were all over the place. Some, the estimates were lower. And so we can't go forward with this yet. It is a pilot study. It shouldn't, you can debate whether it should even have been released as a pilot study, but they are pressured so much to be transparent that they did it. They released it. And that's a good thing, but people are drawing conclusions a little too severely from a simple pilot study. It's suggestive, and I think there's probably merit in there. But anyway, so NOAA is going to conduct a larger study, more complex in 2024, involving more states and involving a couple little changes also. And that will most likely be a definitive study. So at least from here, things change because of politics and pressure and all those things. Right now, I don't think you're going to see any changes in the FES survey until they finish a larger one next year. And so then that'll all have to be analyzed. So you're a couple years away from putting any re-estimating the MRIP data series. I think that's what's the next slide? Yeah. So you can go back to the other slide. So what we've been getting is, and you folks should be aware of it because you probably either are going to get it or you already have, is we should discontinue the emergency measure right now. Because obviously we overestimated effort and so overestimated catch, and why are we cutting? Here's where it gets difficult and the arm waving starts. It's counterintuitive, but I'll start with the trend would stay the same. This would become a scalar, more or less. And so what happens when you put less catch in the models is you get less SSB, but then the SSB target drops. The decline in and I'll talk about the striped bass stock primarily, but this will affect all species. The decline in the striped bass SSB is real, whether it's using the current FES or if it's recalibrated. That will not change much. The ability to hit the SSB target will not change much. So what we did is the doubling of harvest, because the same method was used in 21 and 22 when it doubled, would not change if we recalibrated. So everything we're doing is still on target and we still need to do. And that's hard. It's sometimes hard to grasp, but keep in mind, this FES has been going on for quite some time and they recalibrated the entire series. It wasn't just in the last year or two, just because the study came out. Nothing's really changed. So when you take biomass out and less landings, which, if it was overestimated, that's what'll happen. Usually if the models will affect SSB and lower it, but they don't particularly affect F. And that's the more important parameter. And that's how we manage striped bass. So anyway, I know that's, there are some complications there and some things that are hard to understand. But for now, we are providing a lot of oversight. I've talked to the MRIP people, and we'll go forward knowing that in our back pocket, there may have been some overestimation going on. So I'm sure you have some questions, so I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Dr. Armstrong. Questions for Dr. Armstrong? Michael Pierdoc, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Dr. Armstrong. Just for some clarity with the NOAA's details, they pointed out that estimates are 30 to 40% lower for shoreside and private boater. And I suspect, as we've known for many years, the standard deviation or variation for those modes are very high, which are driving them. The fact that we have a situation where this is where the public really has a tough time when they hear this, with the transparency that if you do a study and contact the public 1 month or 2 months after they fished, that is certainly going to have a different outcome than 12 months after they fish, because the recall is going to be different. And that's, the study has pointed that out, and moving forward, they're going to do a 1 month and 2 month interviews. So I think what's tough here is, and I don't believe any you or DMF or NOAA has an answer to this. What does this all mean, other than what they're saying about, there's going to be a 2-year study? Well, like for instance, as Nicola did a great job pointing out the summary of these different species, where there's 10% reductions in many of them, where we may have flaws of 30 to 40%. But also overall, if the ABC's exceeded and we have an issue with the overall catch with a select stock, that the recreational is over 30, 40%, that's also going to have a detrimental impact at commercial end, because management measures or accountability measures are going to have to be taken to address that overage. So as I sit here, I don't know if it's more of a comment or a question, but where do we go from here? Because there's some significant cuts or ongoing cuts to seasons and bag limits for not only striped bass and other species. And you did a great job of pointing out the difference with the striped bass, but still the numbers are inconsistent because of what's been pointed out. But where do we go from here to try to address this? And is there something Mass DMF can do to try to address this with this and other species, other than to the detriment of the commercial and recreational community, when cuts have to be implemented, and then one cannot catch what's truly in the ocean that they should have access to? So your thoughts?
Yeah, you just threw a lot out there. Yeah, I mean, keep in mind they're seeking the truth, and that's what we all want. So they, going forward, I don't believe anything will happen in the short term, because it's a pilot study. It can't be used in its current condition. I don't believe they will want to move forward like that. But similar to what was happened when they put the FES in effort, and therefore landings, harvests went up in almost every instance to a varying degree. That'll happen again. And I mean, if the finding from the new study is the same, they will have to recalibrate and change the whole time series. That being said, when you do that, you then change MSY and you change the SSB targets. But like I said, F isn't particularly as affected as much. I mean, there's a caveat that patterns change, but in general, just lower SSB. So in its purest form, everything that they're doing now is okay. It just will be SSB will be lower. And they may have to lower quotas and RHLs and things like that. But the pattern of what we're seeing of overfishing and underfishing shouldn't change that much. I say that with a large caveat. What we're seeing for most of those species we just saw, and this is all species, it's the projections. They are the bane of fisheries management. We pretend we know what recruitment will be. We pretend we know what natural mortality will be. We could pretend we know what the predators and the prey base will be. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. You know, Atlantic herring were managed exactly how they're supposed to be for MSY, and they collapsed because Mother Nature. Striped bass has got 5 locked and loaded bad year classes, not because we don't have enough SSB, because Mother Nature's not cooperating, Chesapeake Bay. So I'll leave it at that, but the pattern should stay the same, relatively the same. And we're just going to have to see when the study's done. So for now, Mike, just thinking off the top of my head, I don't think we can do much about where we're at right now. To be honest, if that was my pilot study, I'm not sure I would have released it if it's not ready for prime time. But in the, for transparency, they want to know everything that's going on. But it's probably got an element of truth in it. We probably are overestimating. So, we can consider that as we go forward. But it's, we can't change the rules based on, we think it might be overestimated.
You good, Michael? Mike,
Yeah, just thank you, Mike. I just asked for some food for thought. I mean, this just hit what was it, last week? We're all still trying to take this in. There's very many people from the public upset. And just food for thought of whether DMF can do something. I'm not sure whether they can or help facilitate something to address this. But I just throw it out there for further discussion. And I'd be happy to offline have further discussion to, see whether there's any options, because this is so new and just hit the public. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Any other questions for Dr. Armstrong? I'm not seeing any hands raised. Tim Brady, you're recognized.
Thank you, Ray. Mike, so what I'm taking from this is that was this a third-party evaluation of how the MRIP data is accumulated?
No, the study was done by MRIP staff themselves. But it was overseen by a review panel of, I think it was 3 top statisticians who were some of the world's experts on survey design. And they reviewed the whole thing, and they agreed it was done properly as a pilot. And there's a lot of questions that still remain.
So it was this third-party panel looking at the MRIP staff saying that it's likely that the fishing effort is being overestimated from the recreational side.
It is, yeah, I think, I can't remember their comments exactly, but I think they agree. I mean, the last sentence of the study is, we're probably overestimating. The degree is different. I mean, when you look at a coast-wide estimate for these different species, the change isn't as bad. It's when you start slicing and dicing into waves and modes and states that the variability is introduced. And, it's just another illustration that it was a survey that was not designed to be sliced and diced to a really fine level. It was designed to get a coastal estimate of removals, which is what goes in the stock. Yeah.
So, to me, this is another great example of why recreational fishing and for-hire fishing are two different animals and should be regulated differently. A charter boat going out for striped bass today in Plymouth has got to turn in a fishing vessel trip report with the hours of effort, the species that they catch, the species that they release. They're submitting all this data that is verifiable, much more verifiable than anything you can get from MRIP. So I just wanted to state that, and that's where the for-hire fleet is coming from when we say it's just not the same thing. And I know that this is preliminary, but this speaks to what we're talking about when we say for-hire versus recreational fishing. Thanks.
Yeah, and that's why for hire wasn't included in this, because if the FES is not used, they have a separate effort survey. As you know, they make phone calls to charter captains.
Well, not just phone calls, but actual fishing vessel trip reports, like putting the data in there, typing the data in after the trip.
Yeah, I hate to say, but those data aren't used very much. They're not used in the same manner as MRIP data. They're used for a few species to calibrate effort, but the actual landings that are on VTRs are not used.
Still not used.
Still not used.
Okay.
But the problem is, and I'll throw this out there, we found during CARES about 10% of the people who were supposed to be putting in VTRs don't. And that's the trouble with using VTRs or any other self-reporting system. So we're a long ways from those data being able to use. I mean, head boats are probably much better because you're such a small finite pool, but
yeah, getting smaller all the time.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Questions for Dr. Armstrong? If I see no further questions, we're going to take a 5-minute break, and then we've got 3 more discussion items, which I want to move through, because I know there are a couple of people who want to talk during the public comment. So, Story, it looks like you're up after this 5-minute break.
Okay, we'll be ready and go through it quick.
Thank you. 5-minute break, Jared.
Sure thing.
Reconvene at what? 11:03 or 11:02? 11:02.
Sure.
Thank you. Hey, Bill.
Hey, Ray, why don't we get there before you?
Dr. Mike Armstrong, I wanted to thank you for your explanation of that bombshell letter that Noah put out last week.
Oh, my pleasure.
Thank you, Mike. We appreciate it. Let's move this along to the performance of the 2023 quota, managed fisheries and future management outlook. I presume Story and his staff are going to deal with this, Dan.
That's right, Ray. Yep.
Okay.
Story?
Yep. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Anna's going to kick it off. These are fresh numbers that she's run this morning during the meeting. So we'll get right to it and give an update on where we're at on most of our quota managed species. Anna?
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. So as Story mentioned, this is late breaking news. We updated it as of this morning. Data are current more or less through Saturday, at the last full calendar week. Start with black sea bass. We are trending higher this year than we have in previous years. But this is a relatively typical rate for this fishery. It's not that much higher yet. We'll see what happens over the course of September, given weather, et cetera, and see where. I'm getting a little feedback, but I'm not sure if it's me or not.
You're good.
Okay. So yeah, we're a little over halfway, and we do expect to hit this quota sometime in September, pending any weather changes.
And in terms of the outlook for next year, as Nicola mentioned, we're looking at a 25% increase in our commercial quota for sea bass, which would be approximately 930,000 pounds. So we don't have a projection here, when we might take that, but it would likely be, the fishery extending into the early part of October are under the existing rules. So just keep that in mind, and we'll see where we end up this year and think about that again relative to any potential changes if necessary for next year.
Let's keep this rolling.
Yep. Moving on to bluefish. We're actually having a pretty good year for bluefish as well. This is kind of the first year we've seen this in a while. So there's a bit of an uptick over the last couple of weeks.
And next year, the projection is a 40% reduction, which would put us down to about 200,000 pounds. So if landings were similar to this year, we'd be monitoring pretty closely for a potential end of August type of closure. So, just as a heads up for next year, we'll watch that.
Yep.
Okay.
Moving on to striped bass, we closed as of last Friday. We projected we would not have a full day left after last week, which is approximately true. We may see a few more landings come in for the past couple of weeks, but overall, we're probably going to land around 96%.
And interestingly, on this one, last week, the only thing that really brought a closure date into question for us was some bad weather. You'll remember last Tuesday and Wednesday, it was windy on either side of a front that came through. I think it was Tuesday night. That did reduce the landings quite a bit. And you can actually see that on the sea bass slide we went through as well. But that having been said, we did project we wouldn't have enough for a full day. And that was the case. Historically, the last day of a season for striped bass is generally a lot higher than most days. And it was that Monday that there was a problem with a few weeks ago with fishing, people fishing illegally on Sunday night. So anyway, we made that decision, and it appears that it was the right one. And we always have a little bit of landings trickle in. We will end up a little bit under, but less than a full day. And next year, there's a potential decrease, as Nicola mentioned, potential of about 14% and some adjustments in the quota based on any changes to the size. So we'll monitor that going forward.
For fluke, we are trending again higher than last year. But again, this is similar to last year, where it's also due to higher landings in the winter, more so than an increase over the summer. We are seeing a pretty standard rate over the last couple of years of landings over the summer, but there has not been an uptick with the increase in possession limits, at least not that we've seen so far.
And then looking ahead, Nicola teased this, that Massachusetts would, because of quirk in the rules, I guess you'd say, Nick could explain it better if we need to, but Massachusetts will be taking more than that 40 or 42% reduction. We'll actually have to take a 56% reduction next year, which would bring us down to about 600,000 pounds. Today, we're at 531,000 pounds with these existing rules. And if you kind of project it out on the trajectory we're at, you know, we'd be looking at a potential closure in early September, maybe. So, and that gets to Bill's comment earlier about making sure that there's a viable, the quota allows for a viable inshore fishery. So, you know, given this year's catch rate and even previous years, you can see where we get to with about 600,000 pounds, and it's somewhere into September. So we'll have to watch that as we, you know, think about next year and what that might look like.
Horseshoe crab, as you all know, we decreased the quota to 140,000 this year. That did result in an earlier closure than normal. Well, actually, we've hardly ever had a closure except for in 2019. So we closed as of August 6th, which is about a few weeks earlier than the closure in 2019. And we had kind of banner months in May and early June, and that kind of triggered the concern about an earlier closure. We did drop those possession limits to extend it a little bit, and it did work. Extended probably another 2 to 3 weeks.
And we were able to monitor this one really closely. The industry, the dragger fleet, and the biomedical firms were really working with us to provide good information. We knew when they were switching over to using more biomedical crabs instead of the bait crabs in the rent-a-crab program for bleeding. So we were able to, with their cooperation, keep pretty close tabs on this. And as you know, we do have the biomedical quota, which where each firm was given an allotment of 100,000 biomedical crabs. That's confidential, but we are monitoring that, and we'll be communicating with those firms should they get close to their allotted number of crabs.
That's all we have for our quota species. We do have some information on value available if anyone is interested. We can also hold that. And
do you want to show Menhaden real quick?
Oh yeah, sorry, I forgot that one.
Yeah, Menhaden's real different this year. You know, it's not pressing. That's why it might have slipped your mind, Anna, because we've only caught about 2 million pounds of the 10 million pound quota, 10 million plus. Many of the participants, because of the lack of fish in nearshore waters, have not been going, especially the larger outfits. Some have kind of packed it up for the year. Others, the other handful, are hopeful of a run at some point, the fall run in September. But you know, what we believe is that the fish went through our waters early or even around state waters. Maine has their fisheries been slower. It's been reports of fish in Canada. So this quota likely won't be taken unless something changes drastically soon. And, you know, we might have to consider some tweaks, maybe to the start date for next year. We'll have to work with the industry on that. But you can see we're at about 2 million pounds, very different than the previous handful of years.
Story.
Yeah.
This is Dan. So I believe our current regulations are sort of engineered for the kind of year we had last year, which was a robust fish. heavy landings for a month or a few weeks, and then we scale it down to a 25,000 pound trip limit to allow the bait or the product to come in kind of steady for a couple of months. But in the absence of those heavy landings at the beginning of the year, should we hit that 50%, later in the fall, we probably don't need that 25,000 pound trip limit. So we should probably go to, and I'm sure Jared would speak up here, go to a, what do you call it, an in-season adjustment to maybe lift that 25,000 pound, second, that trip limit, so that higher levels of landings could come in during, say, like October, November, even December, if there's fish coming in from elsewhere. Anyway, that's, Jared, do you want to comment on that as part of a strategy to fully utilize the quota?
Sure. I think that's a good thought, Dan, and something we can bring to the commission for their September meeting, should we be staring down that trigger, and likely something that if we're going to go out to rulemaking on Menhaden next year, we may want to just directly incorporate into the regs that if, that 50% trigger is not reached by September 1st, then no trip limit reductions occur.
Yeah, good call.
Good. Mr. Chair, we can certainly take questions, and we could do the value slides that we have, kind of an update on where we're at another meeting, if you'd like to save time.
Thank you, Story. Thank you, Anna. Bill Amaru, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Two things. Could we go back to the the horseshoe crab slide? This is only a technical recommendation. I'm really impressed with how good the division does it at monitoring and getting the information out on the internet. We're looking at it all the time. Obviously, as commercial people, we want to be up to date, know what our potential landing will be in the future, how to balance our time at sea. So what I would say about the horseshoe crab, it's just the way the chart is presented. But because there are two fisheries that are distinct quotas, I'd like to see, instead of horseshoe crab dash closed as of August 6th, 2023, I'd like to see it describe the actual fishery that was closed, the bait fishery, because we still have an active fishery going on. And there will be people who may be looking at this kind of information and will say, hey, how come we're seeing so many horseshoe crabs being landed on the docks when supposedly the fishery is closed? So if you could and then underneath in smaller letters, running total of bait landings, horseshoe crab, does say that, but it's in small print and it's easy to miss it.
Yeah, no problem.
So I just like to see those two described independently. And then
that's good feedback.
Thank you. And then the next thing, Story, I'm very happy to hear you mention my concern about how we're going to distribute our state allocation of fluke, and then to hear that it's actually more like a 50% cut. Wow, that's going to be an enormous shift. And we're going to have to think hard and long, and I'm glad that we're talking about it now, because we want to be prepared for how we're going to approach divvying up this very, very considerable amount of quota that will be available. As compared, it's still a lot more than some years were back in the ancient periods, but it's going to be a heck of a cut for a lot of people. So those are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Dan?
Ray, staff have some value slides prepared. Would you like them to take a few minutes and share them?
Yes, by all
Okay,
means.
great. Thanks.
All right, Anna, why don't you move ahead to those?
All right, so this, you've seen similar slides before, but this just compares value and pounds landed, so you can kind of get a sense of whether it's price or whether it's landings that are driving these changes. But for 2023, we're kind of in the middle of the road of the last few years, kind of lower than 21 and 2022 for value, and landings are down significantly, but more closely to 2022. So in 2022, prices were still a little higher, even though they weren't as high as 2021. And it looks like in 2023, this is actually being driven mostly by scallop landings. There is a decrease in price there that is causing most of that value reduction. But overall, other species are trending either similarly above or below, much closer to the two previous years. I can go through those top 3 species after this as well. So here you can see that scallop decrease. This is driven primarily due to our landings are actually relatively similar to 2022 at this point. So that does indicate that it's a price decrease causing that drop. And this scallop is over 50% of our value in the state of Massachusetts. So it does drive our overall trends for the most part. Lobster, it's very similar to 2022, if not slightly above. Landings are also slightly above 2022 and approximately the same. So that indicates a relatively stable price. There may be some fluctuations in there driving some of this as well. And for oyster, which is our 3rd highest valued species, but at a much lower rate than lobster and scallop, you can see we're a little bit lower than the past couple of years. Landings are also down. So again, this indicates a relatively stable price, but just a lower amount of product being landed. And that's all I have on that. Story, do you have anything you want to add?
No. That's
Thank
good.
you, Anna. Thank you, Story. I have a question for Mike Piernock. Michael.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Story. Thank you, Anna. Do you have a summary for SCUP for their landings? That's one question. And for Menhaden, with it being down significantly, 2 million instead of, up towards that quota, does that have anything to do with the right whale closures and the fact that the traps weren't out there and there wasn't any need for the bait? Is that the result of that? And then lastly, for striped bass, do you have the size and location distribution of the catch? Do you have any details concerning that for striped bass?
Anna, let me start with Menhaden.
Okay.
Yeah,
I can do the other 2.
Okay, so we'll start with Menhaden. I think the short answer is no. I don't think this was impacted by the later start to the lobster season. I think this was truly about the availability of the fish. And remember, we had a June 15th opening date this year instead of June 1st. The idea was to better align the season with the need for lobster bait, but it was more about the availability of the fish for the participants starting on June 15th. They just really weren't there. There was very little early, and then it really petered out. So it was more about the supply available than the demand.
And then regarding SCUP, no, I did not do this for SCUP for this year. Generally, the landings are so low in general that it doesn't, there's not much to look at. So I could do that for the next time though. So you can stand by on that. And then for striped bass, sorry, I'm forgetting what the question was now.
Where it might be coming from.
Oh, yeah. So I did look at that a couple of weeks ago. I haven't looked at it since, but I think this pattern holds. It was roughly like 35% South Shore, 65% North Shore.
Were you using port of landing from the dealer?
Yeah. So any port I counted as north is Boston and north. Anything south of Boston is considered south. And that split was approximately 60-40.
So it's kind of continuing that shift to more of a North Shore fishery than a Cape Cod and
that
South
is
Shore,
similar
South Coast.
to the last 2 years.
Yeah.
And it may have that percentage may have shifted even further over the last couple of weeks. I did not get to that this morning.
Thanks, Mona. Michael, you good?
Just one last, do you have any information on size distribution or how many pounds of a certain striped bass size that was caught? Is it separated that way, or is just total poundage?
It is only total poundage. We do not get length information directly. There are some port sampling effort or some dealer sampling efforts that may have some of that information. We can look into it.
Thank you. And a concern in scup, I understand why if it's not necessary to put it out there because it's so little. I just wanted to confirm it. Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you, Michael. Nicola, I saw your hand raised. Did you have a comment or a question?
Oh, thanks, Mr. Chairman. I was just gonna note that the winter one period for scup this year on a coastwide basis was about 78 or 80% of the quota being taken. That's January through April. And then it looks like, this isn't the most up-to-date information, but it looks like we're at about 30% of our state summer period allocation for scup.
Thank you. Any further questions for Honor or Story?
Not seeing any, Mr. Chair.
Then let's move it along. Convening the MFAC Commercial Striped Bass Focus Group. Who's in charge of this?
Dan? You want to take the reins on this one? Well, I'll jump in, Mr. Chair. I think with some of the quota adjustments going on, as that information emerges, we're probably going to want to convene some focus groups of the commission. Striped bass in particular, but maybe even a focus group on summer flounder or black sea bass as well, to discuss and develop some preliminary proposals for how we may want to manage the fishery in 2024, given either quota decreases or quota increases. So we'll be in touch with that. I believe we have a standing commercial striped bass focus group, and if we decide we need similar action on other quota managed species, we'll turn to you to develop focus groups for those and get back to you at the September meeting on that.
Okay, so you have.
We will likely convene the striped bass focus group if it's confirmed that the quota will be reduced. And then we may convene other focus groups for other quota managed species with some further deliberation.
So we're not talking about doing a striped bass focus group meeting before the annual meeting.
I would doubt that.
Okay, thank you.
We want to see where the quota change ends up before we convene the group.
Thank you.
So thanks, Jared. Thanks for stepping in. Had some computer issues, but I could still hear. So Ray, I think you're aware that the issue that we have with a kind of an optics challenge where the recreational community is being told to, not fish on that 2015 year class. And yet for management purposes, we're pushing our commercial fishery onto that year class, essentially with us along, the 35-inch minimum size. So I'd be interested in trying to figure out if there is a way for us to take a second look at that. It would mean maybe coming up with a maximum size in our commercial quota. So I'm interested in that, but I think we probably need to know exactly what our requirements are going to be, but I'd be certainly interested in hearing from commission members and, even the public about, and we certainly have already heard from the public. Every time we take any action on these recreational measures, such as the initial one back in May and the most recent one when ASMFC extended it, we get hit pretty hard with a lot of critics of our commercial fishery. So I am interested in seeing if there's things we can address that would improve conservation and sort of resolve some of those optics issues.
Yeah, well, one thing I'll put it out there right now. Right now, we have a bag limit of 15 fish. So if, for reasons of conservation, we are going to move the minimum size down on the commercial fleet, I think we'd have to have the technical committee look at it and tell us, well, how many 28-inch fish will yield what 15, 35-inch fish would yield weight-wise, because that's what the commercial guys are concerned about. Because you've got, you know, they're restricted to 15 fish, so a 28-inch fish is going to weigh a lot less than a 35-inch fish. And they fish by weight, as Anna just said. They don't fish per fish, they fish by weight. That's how they get paid. So I would like to convene a meeting just to come up with some numbers so they don't get slapped in the face.
Yeah, that's fair. My overriding concern is with 4,000 permit holders. If we make it so easy to catch these fish, we could be using up this quota in the way we used to back in about 20 years ago, where we used it up in a matter of 2 or 3 weeks.
Yeah, by July 4th.
Yeah, and that's not a good objective either. So we've got some challenges to address, and you know, we have to decide you know, which ones we want to take on. So yeah, I wouldn't be opposed to having a meeting to sort of like bring some of the issues forward. So Ray, you bring up an interesting one about weight, but you know, you have to counter, you know, the degree of ease of catching those smaller fish, and are you going to create market gluts? Because right now it's you know, we kind of have managed this adaptively based on last year's in the previous years fishing trends, where we tweak here, we tweak there, and we wind up coming in kind of with some predictable results. But if we change the size limits dramatically, we could have a big change in the daily quota utilization that would require some other changes. So anyway, I'm open-minded. I'd like to, you know, my philosophy is to keep the commercial fishery viable and as long as we can. And I don't want to lose it because of some folks, you know, emotional, reaction to the commercial fishery that results in legislation being filed or folks getting so upset about it. So I'd like to be as responsible as possible, and I think we should look at all different options.
All right, so what I'm hearing then is we will have a meeting at some point prior to the annual meeting.
I think we should. I think
Thank
we should. Yeah.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you, Director.
Mhm.
Jared, put that in your notes, please.
Done.
Thank you, sir. Any other thoughts about this before we move on to offshore wind? Not seeing any hands. Offshore wind energy development update.
Yeah, I'd like to introduce Dr. Justin Bopp, our newest hire. And as I mentioned in my opening comments, he's now the primary person at DMF dealing with the offshore wind issues. In the past, it's been a combination of myself and Story Reed, sometimes Bob Glenn, and of course, sometimes Melanie Griffin, because a lot of it's federally impacts federal fisheries management. So we were fortunate enough to post a position about, I don't know, last fall. We hired Justin. He's just come on over the last couple of months. And I thought that in the past, when Kathleen Ford was the lead, some of those presentations were really valuable to bring the commission up to speed. And because we have a person of Justin's capabilities doing this as a full-time assignment, I think the commission would really benefit from not only hearing from him, but knowing he's the go-to person if any of you have questions on offshore wind, to be able to reach out to him. So Justin, why don't you begin your presentation?
And thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, so I'm honored to be here at Massachusetts Division of Marine Fisheries as the new offshore wind specialist. And as you all know, offshore wind is ever changing and there's many different updates. And so today, what I wanted to talk about was currently what's going on with the status of the Southern New England offshore wind projects in federal waters just south of Rhode Island and Massachusetts, and then also touch upon what's going on in the Gulf of Maine. But before I do that, I just want to, go over briefly, what my role is here at Massachusetts DMF for offshore wind. one of my primary duties is to, review and comment on offshore wind developer environmental reviews and permits. And under that umbrella, on behalf of DMF, in coordination with other staff members throughout DMF, we recommend mitigation strategies for potential impacts on fisheries habitats, resources, and also the fishing industry. And we also review monitoring and research plans conducted by offshore wind developers, just to make sure that their research plans can adequately address their objectives and monitor any change in fisheries resources. We also participate in agency-led working groups. This is the Fisheries Working Group led by our counterparts, the Coastal Zone Management Office, as part of the EEA division. And we also participate in stakeholder outreach, and that involves, interacting with you all as fishermen, as well as directly participating and commenting on different documents with the developers. And then we also work with federal and state agencies focused on offshore wind developments, impact assessments on both fisheries and environmental resources, and recommend impact mitigation with them as well. So as you all probably are aware of this map, this is showing you a lot of these southern New England wind projects that are either under construction, under environmental review, or have been leased out throughout the federal waters just south of Rhode Island and the islands of Massachusetts. Currently, there are 7 active projects that are under environmental review or construction, and I just want to highlight, them briefly. So we have Revolution Wind and South Fork Wind directly under the Rhode Island, Massachusetts border. Sunrise Wind just below them. Bay State Wind as you head further down to the southeast. New England Wind and Vineyard Wind. Beacon Wind. What was formerly known as Mayflower Wind is now South Coast Wind. So that's been another kind of frustrating part of offshore wind tracking, is that these project names have not always stayed consistent. So I just want you to be aware of that. And we also have Vineyard Wind Northeast. And one kind of newer name as well as the New England Wind, which was formerly the Vineyard Wind Southeast. So I just wanted to update you all on that. And 2 projects that are currently underway in terms of construction are Vineyard Wind and South Fork Wind, which are highlighted in these yellow circles here. And among all these different projects, the export cables that transport energy from these wind energy areas vary from landing in New York, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts. And I'm going to be going briefly into some of these more specifics in the next few slides for each of these projects. But one thing that I want you to note is that cabling, foundation, and service platform installations have been underway for Vineyard Wind and South Fork Wind. And they're estimated to be completely operational and complete by 2023 to 2024. All these other projects, their estimated completion date and operation date would be 2024 to 2028 in terms of starting those operations completely. So for Vineyard Wind 1, the construction has started in spring of 2023. And the export cabling has been completed as of July of this year. And you can see here in this map, the export cable is going through the northern part of Vineyard Wind, the Muskegon Channel, all the way up to landfall at Covell's Beach in the town of Barnstable. There's proposed 65 wind turbine generator monopiles, as well as having a gridded array of spacing of 1 by 1 nautical miles of each of these wind turbine locations. You can see these green dots locating those proposed wind turbine generator locations. As of at the current date, there's only been 6 turbine monopile foundations installed. The plan is to start simultaneously installing the turbines on top of these already placed foundations in this lower map. Sorry if it's very small, but you can see these 6 current turbine installation foundations. And their plan is to complete all of this by the end of this year. And it's expected that no more than 2 foundations will be placed per day throughout this process. And it takes about 2 to 3 hours of pile driving to install each of these foundations. And we have yet to know what the status of the inter-array turbine cables. That's to be determined. So we do not know when those will be placed, probably likely as soon as all these turbines are up and running. And then I want to move on to South Fork Wind, the other project that's further along in construction. So Currently, there have been all 12 proposed wind turbine foundations installed in South Fork Wind. Something that differentiates this area is that the export cable is actually going to New York and not into Massachusetts or Rhode Island. And there's continued construction planned for areas where the cable was not up to its target burial of around 6 feet. So if there was exposed parts of the cable, the plan in the coming months is to assess those areas and lay these concrete mattresses to protect the cable in areas where the target burial was not possible. The estimated completion entirely of this project is the end of 2023. For Sunrise Wind, it's currently under draft environmental impact review. So what this environmental review impact statement is it's a document required by the National Environmental Policy Act that includes an analysis of different alternatives proposed by your developers in terms of potential cabling areas, potential secondary protection areas where the cable is not able to be buried adequately. So those sorts of actions are assessed, and we can then compare those proposed actions to these alternatives and look at the potential impacts on these marine fisheries resources. And currently, the status of this project in Sunrise Wind is that there's no active offshore construction at this time because BOEM needs to first approve the environmental impact statement and then subsequently approve the construction operation plan for this project. So the anticipated offshore construction is not scheduled until 2024, to either that first or second quarter, and the estimated completion of this project is not until the end of 2025. And the total area of this project is 172 square miles with 94 wind turbine locations. For Revolution Wind, it's a little further along, and it's currently has the final environmental impact statement that's published. Currently, no active offshore construction is underway, and they're still awaiting approval by BOEM for their construction and operation plan. Anticipated offshore construction is not until 2024. And the proposed landfall is in North Kingston, Rhode Island. So you can see the offshore export cable is going north of Revolution Wind into the Narragansett Bay area up into North Kingston, Rhode Island. New England Wind currently has 2 phases of different projects known as Park City Wind and Commonwealth Wind. And it's just south of Vineyard Wind. You can see here Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket. This is where the export cable is going to be passing through. Through the Muskegon Channel, similar to what Revolution Wind is. They're actually sharing that same export corridor, cable corridor as Revolution Wind. So Park City Wind is the first phase of this development. You can see in this colored image here, it's this purple area. Commonwealth Wind is phase 2 of this project. They both plan to share the same export cable corridor and with slightly different landfall areas. So Park City Wind is expected to have that cable landing in Covell's Beach, town of Barnstable, whereas Commonwealth Wind is planning to land the cable at Dowses Beach in the town of Barnstable. And currently, again, no active offshore construction with this project, just awaiting final approval of the COP and environmental impact statement. And then South Coast Wind, highlighted here, has 3 export cables, 2 different export corridors that are planned or proposed. So you can see in this image here, it's sharing some of that export cable corridor as Revolution Wind as one route, and then another route going north of all of these other projects to the west into the Secondot River and Mount Hope Bay in Massachusetts. So there's currently no active construction going on here. And again, waiting final approval of that COP before construction can begin. And the anticipated offshore construction, which will start with cabling, is proposed to be in the first quarter of 2024. And then lastly, in terms of the Southern New England project update, again, Beacon Wind is one of the ones that are, again, not under active construction. They just finished public scoping meetings, so it's going to be at least 2 years until construction would even begin, because the environmental review process takes about 2 years on average, according to BOEM. And the proposed landfall of this cable would wrap around Long Island from the South Shore into Long Island Sound, and would then be landing that export cable at Waterford, Connecticut, and Queens, New York. And I want to just transition into updating you all on the Gulf of Maine. So as you all are aware, the Gulf of Maine has had a draft wind energy area called on by BOEM. And in this map presented on the right-hand side here, you can see the original request for information areas, this black line here. This is the original area of where potential wind energy areas could be proposed, and BOEM has since reduced that to this green area after taking in potential sensitive fisheries consideration areas, such as parts of the Lobster Management Area 1, Platts Bank, George's Bank, Cash's Ledge, and the Western Gulf of Maine, as well as taking into consideration of other marine sanctuaries such as Stellwagen Bank. They have been excluded from the draft call energy area. The final wind energy areas will be determined in the last quarter of 2023. BOEM is currently undergoing a spatial modeling process that incorporates 5 different submodels containing data for national security, natural resources, fisheries, off the offshore wind industry themselves, and other maritime industries. So essentially, they're incorporating a bunch of different data sets across these industries and coming up with a cumulative model that will assess the wind energy suitable areas for these finalized wind energy areas. And so there's still a period for some comment on that interaction with BOEM on these draft wind energy areas, but it's looking like November is when these final wind energy areas will be determined. And leasing will likely begin probably sometime in 2024 to 2025. The leasing process typically takes about a year and a half before site assessment plans can begin. And the Gulf of Maine, just in terms of some more updates here, is that it's around 9.9 million acres in terms of this current wind energy call area. And it's expected that many of these wind turbines will be different than the Southern New England turbines, and the fact that they'll be floating offshore wind, given the depths. Typically, depths greater than 50 meters often require floating offshore wind turbines. So just keep that in mind. And we currently do not know what the full schematics of these floating offshore winds and their cables will look like. That's something we're still waiting to discuss with BOEM. It's probably likely that more schematics will come out once these final wind energy areas are determined. And then we also wanted to update you on this research lease area granted to the state of Maine. It's a 12 turbine array. You can see in this red box, there's this blue inset just southeast of Portland, Maine, just outside of the traffic separation scheme. This research array is around 68,000 acres and will consist of 12 floating offshore wind turbines, and that will provide insight into the potential effects of offshore wind on fish and invertebrate species composition changes. So this site lease area is currently under draft environmental review and has not been completely approved for any construction at this time. But with that, I just wanted to update you on the fact that the offshore wind website through MADMF has been updated, and it contains important information on all of these different project-specific updates, as well as previous comments that both the Coastal Zone Management Office and Division of Marine Fisheries have commented on. So we have those available. You can see what DMF has commented on in previous different phases of environmental review across these projects. And there's also an offshore wind map viewer through the Massachusetts Coastal Zone Management Office. This provides up-to-date status information and an interactive map of all these different ongoing projects relevant to Massachusetts. And with that, if there's time available, I'll take any questions.
Questions for Dr. Bob? Dan McKiernan, you're recognized.
Yeah, so Ray, just for the commission's consideration, Justin has a mastery of a lot of this material, and I think you as chair and as the commission as a body should kind of decide going forward how much information they would want to get on this. Obviously, we have these fishery working group meetings that are held periodically every 2 or 3 months that commission members are certainly welcome to join. But I just really want to make sure that the commission is kept up to date on these these developments. And if you want, we could bring Justin in on like a quarterly basis or whatever, but I leave that up to you and as you receive feedback from the commission on this, how much information, you know, you'd want to him to bring forward. I think it's valuable, but it's up to the commission members.
Thank you, Dan. Khalil.
Thank you, Mr. Excuse me. Thank you. I want to say that this was probably of all the presentations, 7 years I've been on the commission, that this is probably the most comprehensive, and maybe because there's more to report, but this really was a very well done presentation, very clear, concise, to the point, and it showed where things were going to be and or they're proposed to be, and I just want to commend the presentation.
Thank you, Khalil. Other commission members?
Let me say, I would encourage us to be able to get, the director asked if we would like to have more of these. I think would be good for us on a regular basis, if not every month, every other month, or quarterly, to get reports such as this.
Thank you, Khalil.
Thank
Other
you.
members' thoughts?
Seeing any hands raised, Mr. Chair.
Well, I'll ad lib here. What's been done has been done already, you know, south of the island and down towards New York. But I think if we could be updated on what's going to happen in the Gulf of Maine, because I'm hearing there's 5 different polygons we're looking at now. And one of them is 20 miles due east of Provincetown. So Justin, if you could keep us updated on the impending action in the Gulf of Maine, because as I said, what's been done south of us has already been done. And I know there's a lot of concern in New England and Massachusetts about what they're going to do in the Gulf of Maine. So I would really look at that, you know, when you come forward with presentations for the commission.
Yeah, that sounds good, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I will definitely keep everybody abreast on what's been going on with Gulf of Maine, you know, in terms of offshore wind development there, because you're right, it is a big concern for everyone, including ourselves. Yeah, I think, you know, it's as we all know, wind is ever changing. So yeah, having some frequent updates in the Gulf of Maine is really important.
Thank you. Michael Piednock, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Justin, and welcome aboard. I would just request that future charts and details include nautical charts, which will make it easier for us to identify the areas where we fish on the chart. With some of the details you have right now, it's not clear. Make it easier for us and more user-friendly if you could do that in the future, if possible. Yeah. Thank you.
Yes, I can definitely do that, Mike. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bill Amaru.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a very basic question. I've never been able to get an answer on this from anyone. Justin, can you tell me whether or not mobile gear fishing will be allowed within the boundaries of these areas that are going to be dotted with all these towers?
Yeah, so from what we've heard from, BOEM and others, I mean, at least for, you know, the Southern New England areas, right, where there's monopiles installed, and those sorts of foundations, they're anticipating that, you know, fishing should be capable of operating in those wind farm areas. But in terms of, you know, we've heard concerns from fishermen and everyone that, you know, they are planning on avoiding those areas. But according to BOEM and what we're seeing is that, you know, what they're saying is that there should be capabilities of fishing in those areas. But we are still, in talks with BOEM about, the feasibility of that.
Okay, thank you. I do want to say that in some fisheries, regional fisheries, not having access to those areas is tantamount to not going fishing. Those areas are rich and important production areas at certain times of the year for one fishery or another. So let's hope that whatever they've devised for cable protection, it's adequate for us to be able to continue to work around those areas with, I understand, with limits, but still, it's an enormous area when you look at southern New England, behind the islands over towards Long Island. And then we haven't even started to think about what's going to happen in the Gulf of Maine. 20 miles east of Provincetown. It's one of the most productive areas that we've got for mobile and fixed gear. Okay, thank you and good luck, Justin. Looking forward to working with you.
Thank you.
Dan, is that your hand or?
Nope.
No? Okay. Any other questions or comments for the newbie? Just come along, Justin Bopp. Thank you for your presentation, Justin, and we look forward to working with you in the future. I'll talk to commission members and see how often they'd like to hear you report out on what's going on. But, you know, at least at a minimum quarterly, and if you feel it's important, you know, get in touch with the director and tell them you want to be on the agenda and we'll make room for you.
Okay, that sounds good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. By the way, Justin, do you wear a bow tie?
Sometimes depends on the occasion.
Just a question, because we've had previous doctors on the commission who wear bow ties. Thank you.
Thank you.
We can move along. MFAC Permitting Focus Group.
Yeah, I'll take that one, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Dory.
Jared, I'll start sharing my screen. All right, can you see that?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, great. All right, so the Permit Focus Group met last Thursday, the 10th, in the evening to keep going through these fairly complex limited entry permit issues that we have. We kind of started by reminding ourselves of the statement of the problem that we're trying to address, and that's addressing barriers to entry in portfolio diversification of an aging fleet or an aging group of permit holders in some cases. And contributing to that problem are the following: a limited entry permit scheme that is generally required by statute, the availability and costs of permit and permit endorsement transfers, restrictions on immediate family transfers, the current 4 out of 5 year actively fished criteria for transferability, and the need for modifications to current transfer rules to address some of these issues. So that's what we're working on. We've identified 3 steps to enhance permit availability that DMF wants to move forward on. First is the coastal lobster permit bundling policy. This is something we can execute quickly through a policy amendment. Current transfer regulations already allow for the bundling of latent endorsements with the transfer of an active coastal lobster permit, but we haven't included that provision in our existing bundling policy. So we plan to expand that existing bundling policy to allow bundling of latent gear or species-specific endorsements with an active coastal lobster permit in a transfer if the permit holder wants to transfer those. And this would serve to keep fishing businesses whole. An example here would be an active coastal lobster permit being transferred. And this would allow us the ability to include things like an inactive sea bass, fluke, or tautog endorsement as part of that bundle. The bundling policy already has a provision to bundle scup and sea bass pot endorsements with an active coastal lobster permit. So we already have that. So we're just looking to expand that out a bit. 3 endorsements that wouldn't be included in this bundle at this time would be the gillnet endorsement, which is not transferable by regulation, the menhaden endorsement, which by policy we only transfer actively fished menhaden endorsements. We think this is about the right effort there, and the conch pot endorsement, which has a policy dictating that you need 5,000 pounds of conch landings a year to be deemed actively fished. So we won't trump that with this. So that's where we're going with this. We're going to draft that policy in the next week or so, and we can do this quickly because it's policy change. The second bullet here, we intend to begin the process to amend permit endorsement transfer regulations to allow that 4 out of 5 year performance criteria to be waived for the transfer of certain limited entry endorsements to immediate family members. And this would match the coastal lobster LMA1 transfer rules that have been in place for years and allow endorsements to stay within a family even if they don't meet the actively fished criteria. We've received several requests for this change over the past few years, so I do anticipate this change would result in a spike in transfers, maybe 5 to 10 additional transfers a year. For context, we do 100 to 125 transfers a year already, so all of these would add on to that workload, presumably. And again, similar to the bundling policy that I mentioned above, we wouldn't include the gillnet, menhaden, and conchpot endorsements in this rule for the same reasons. So that requires a regulatory change that we would have to do in the fall and winter. The third item here, and potentially the biggest impact to transferability, would come from an adjustment or relaxing of the activity standards required for an endorsement transfer. The idea here is to potentially relax the 4 out of 5 year actively fished criteria to something less restrictive, potentially say 2 out of 4 years actively fished. We had quite a bit of discussion on this during our meeting last week. The 4 out of 5 rule has worked well for the coastal lobster fishery, with the original goal there to reduce the number of permits, and that's worked. But as we look to allow new entrants into these other fisheries, it makes sense to take a look at this standard. We went into last week's meeting with the idea of potentially taking an endorsement by endorsement look at the 4 out of 5 standard, but the conversation last week was moving towards something simpler, and maybe an adjustment across the board, like we throw out here, changing from 4 out of 5 to 2 out of 4. So we have some more work to do on this one. We've been requested by a member of the group to analyze this a little bit, to maybe take an example endorsement and see if we could forecast based on our statistical data, if we change the standard from say 4 out of 5 to 2 out of 4, how many more endorsements might become transferable, just to understand the opportunities we might be creating here. So we're going to work on that in the near term, and work on this particular regulatory proposal more, but we're still in favor of looking at this and relaxing this 4 out of 5 year actively fished criteria. I'll take a quick breath there, and Dan or Jared, if you have anything to add that I might have missed on these three, I'll let you do that.
Oh, I think you're good.
Yeah, I'm all set as well.
Okay. And then the final slide here is on additional ideas that we've heard from the focus group, and these include the potential of creating a permitting program for young fishermen, maybe an apprentice program that would allow them to obtain a permit to get into the fishery. Something like that would require a lot more work and likely require a change to the statute. We also recently got an idea about some sort of permit sharing, which would potentially allow a single limited entry permit or endorsement to be fished by multiple individuals on different days. And just to be clear, this is already allowed for non-owner operator fisheries. For example, the State Waters mobile gear fishery, the coastal access permit fishery, and rod and reel fisheries, if they occur on a boat permit, because those aren't owner operator fisheries. So the permit holder could allow a hired captain or a quote unquote partner to fish the boat on those permits. It's really the owner operator fisheries that the current rules don't allow this for, or if you were thinking about having somebody fish the same permit on a second boat that's not the name boat on the permit. So, you know, those types of changes would require regulatory and statutory changes, but we'll continue to look at it. And then a recent idea came up that we've been looking into a little bit, and this is to more address the costs, and it might be a little bit outside the purview of us, but maybe not. But looking at the idea of a revolving loan fund to help with upfront costs of younger fishermen or potential participants in these fisheries acquiring permits that we know can cost some money. So we're looking at that, and there's all kinds of issues surrounding that, and we'll keep working through those. So that's the update that we have from the meeting. Happy to take questions.
Questions for Story? Bill Amaru.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. That's a really good comprehensive analysis of the meeting the other night, Story. Very well done. I have a question. I think you said that it was already permitted to do a sharing kind of idea. That's the sharing permit sharing with a permit that's already issued to an individual rather than to a boat. How exactly does that? Can you explain that to me?
Sure. So, for example, our pot fisheries, coastal lobster, and the fish pots are their owner operator. So, you know, the permit, meaning the permit holder has to be on board. But some of the other fisheries, like say the mobile gear, you know, the coastal access permit fishery, or a rod and reel fishery, if those endorsements are on a boat permit, it's the owner doesn't have to be on board. So a hired captain or another individual could be fishing it. I understand. I don't know if that answers it, but we can talk a little bit more offline about that too.
The idea would be for an individual with a rod and reel, let's say, and it's in the individual's name. There's no boat associated with it. The person whose name is on the permit has to be on a boat for that boat to be landing the fish.
That's right.
That's right. Okay.
That's right. But so, you know, and back to the idea a little bit, you know, currently our rules, the statute doesn't allow us to list two individuals on a boat. It speaks to an individual permit holder. But even though that's the case, if it's not an owner operator fishery, the permit holder doesn't necessarily have to be on board.
Okay, thank you.
So we can go through some of those details with you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Edmondson.
Thanks, Ray. Mine's more of a comment, if that's okay.
Yes, by all means. Yeah, you're on this subgroups or this focus group, so please, let's hear from you.
Yeah, so I just wanted to say this focus group has been great, and I think some of these things that Story outlined are going to be really helpful, at least in what I'm seeing over here on the vineyard. We have a lot of fishermen kind of entering into the retirement phase, and a lot of young fishermen ready to take on, you know, their businesses. So, you know, that bundling policy where we're keeping their businesses whole and allowing more diversification in the permits that the young fishermen can take on, I think will be really helpful. And I think relaxing the transferability standard, so going to two out of 4 years, I think will be helpful. And as Story mentioned, it'll be great to see some kind of modeling to understand that impact. But I'm happy to see where this is headed, and I think there's some really great short-term things we can do. And in terms of like financing assistance, you know, I'm happy that we can continue to think in the future where we can head to help that part of the puzzle. But I think we're heading in the right direction in terms of increasing permit opportunities. So just wanted to add that.
Thank you, Shelley. So in your opinion, we're moving along on this subject matter.
Yes, I do feel like we're moving along.
Thank you very much. Anybody else from the study group, focus group want to ad lib, make a comment?
The other two aren't on, Bill Doyle and Lou are on today.
They're not on the meeting. All right, thank you. Okay, well, I'm glad to see that's moving along. We're keeping the dialogue open and the group is meeting, and Story, you're doing a good job there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Other business, commission member comments. I'll go around the table when I call your name. Shelley, comments.
I just have one comment to bring up for a possible meeting in the future, focus work group. I've had a number of black sea bass fishermen talking and complaining about just the current 5-day fishing windows and landings, and just wanting to kind of have a focus group to reassess maybe for next year. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
So, yeah, can you repeat the comment? They're looking to change the season or days fishing or what?
I think a combination, maybe days fishing or daily trip landing limits. I think that what I've heard from a lot of sea bass fishermen is, the price is down because the market's flooded because of the amount of days that everyone's allowed to fish. And while it adds some flexibility into, when they can fish in terms of weather, it's just not enough because the price is so low. So I think that there's some conversations to be had to see if tweaking needs to be done. I don't know what the solution is, but I just wanted to put that out there.
Okay, thank you for that. And I guess we have a reason to have a commission meeting over on the vineyard, Jared.
Okay.
With that comment. It used to be conch, we'd go over there for conch, and now it'll be black sea bass. But I personally, I think DMF's done a good job with the black sea bass. They're allowed to fish how many days a week? How many days a week, Jared, can they fish?
5, it's Sunday through Thursday.
Yeah. But anyways, yeah, we can leave that to a commission meeting and get input from fishermen on the vineyard. And then I imagine it'd have to go to public hearing so all black sea bass pot fishermen can partake. Thank you, Shelley. Khalil.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm all set.
Thank you, Khalil. Bill Amaru.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, we have some substantial challenges ahead of us coming from multiple directions. It's going to be a very interesting upcoming decade for fishing in New England and Massachusetts in particular. So stand by, keep your pencils sharp. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Mike Piednock.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. All set.
Thank you, Michael. Suki.
Yeah, thanks, Ray. This is to Dan and Bob. What's the status of approving the new candy cane rope with the Massachusetts tracer in it as part of the regulations to be a gear marking requirement?
Bob?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. Hi, Suki. Yeah, we've received samples from Beth, and one of our staff members, Dave Chosit, is working down the Science Center I believe, this week to have the strength test done, which we anticipate will be fine. Once that clears, and with NOAA Fisheries, which should be pretty short, I've already talked with Jared, and our plan would be to potentially this fall, Jared, you can hop in here, introduce this in a regulations package to amend our regulations to allow the tracer in lieu of the state gear marking requirements. So our hope is to have that up and running by this winter. That's the hope. Jared, I don't know if you want to add to that or
That's adequate, Bob. Would be once we get the information back from Dave and Noah, we can begin to work towards rulemaking on that. So you'll likely see that come across at maybe the September or October commission meeting as an item for future public hearing with the intention of getting that done for the 2024 season.
Yeah, okay. That was my hope. It would be done by, everybody brings their gear in and one will be working, changing buoy lines and stuff. That would be a nice option for everybody to, save a lot of work where you have to mark everything now and just use the rope with the tracer and it will go a long ways. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no problems. And that's the plan. And just the early indications, I've passed samples and pictures up to NOAA Fisheries up at Garfo. And in principle, they are on board with using it in lieu of gear marking. So it's pretty promising.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you, Suki. Bob, one question. You would have this tracer breakaway gear available to the harvesters so they can work on their buoy lines over the winter as opposed to, getting it next spring?
Yeah, that's the hope, Mr. Chair. The manufacturer has created it. They haven't gone into full production at this point because we got to make sure that it's approved. But we would anticipate purchasing a bunch and distributing it this fall and winter to fishers, and also it should be commercially available as well. That's the hope.
Thank you, Bob. Tim Brady.
Yes, thanks, Ray. I just have one brief comment that I'm happy to see that it's not a Massachusetts thing per se, but that the regional council is looking more at establishing the different regulations between for hire and recreational fishing. They're two different animals, and they need to be treated differently. They need to be regulated differently. And if you're going to regulate someone as a commercial fishery, they should be treated as a sector of the commercial fishery with different regulations than a recreational angler. Thanks.
Thank you, Tim. And once again, I'd just like to thank all members for participation in today's meeting, along with the staff at DMF. We've got a number of staff on board today for this meeting, and I certainly appreciate their input. And they're even listening into commission meetings. It's gotten better and better over the years, from years ago when we had commission meetings. So my heart goes out to commission members and to staff. Thank you very much. And I'd like to open this up to public comment, because at least one dragoman or otter trawler got in touch with me and said he would try to phone in for public comment. So have we got anybody there, Jared?
Oh, hold on. Phil, you recognized? Phil, you have to unmute yourself.
That's Phil Michaud, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Bill, you're on.
Phil, you're still muted. Should be a microphone icon you can hit to unmute yourself. All right, Mr. Chair, I'm not sure how we're going to resolve this. If Phil wants to email me, I can forward his email along to the full commission for them to take in his comment.
Yeah, by all means. I'm sorry that he can't unmute himself on his phone, but that being said, I need a motion to adjourn.
I'll make the motion, Ray.
Thank you, Dr. Evanson. I need a second.
Second.
And is there any opposition?
Not seeing any hands raised.
Thank you. This August meeting is adjourned. Thank you very much for your attendance. There's Phil's hand once again, but unless you can get him unmuted.
No, I don't think I can.
Okay. Meeting's adjourned.